There is a problem in the world of fictional pirate cinema. Not just one problem actually, but at least 4 problems. A series of factors that make the modern One Piece films very financially lucrative, but negatively impact the experience of these movies as a whole. At least in my opinion. You may have different opinions, and look, if so, stop it. But to understand where we are now, there was a time where the One Piece movies were in a lot of trouble. And the producer of what went on to become Strong World was incredibly worried about the future of the One Piece film franchise. The problem was that no one really cared enough to go out and see the movies, because they were mostly low-stakes stories with throwaway characters, and it was kind of like paying to see an anime filler arc. There were exceptions to this, of course, there's always exceptions, but that was the general vibe of what we're going to call the classic One Piece movies. And they were performing so poorly that a decision was made to do something quite drastic and have Eiichiro Oda himself write and produce the next film. That, of course, went on to be Strong World, and it grossed $60 million worldwide, which was more than 3 times what the film before it managed to conjure, and by far the most successful One Piece movie at that time. And what this did was establish a formula for the modern One Piece films going forward. Everything that Strong World did was taken, compounded, and continuously escalated. Oda's original idea for Strong World was an emotional story about Nami's parents, but he eventually scrapped that in favor of making it a more excited, action-oriented experience for his target audience of young boys. And that has resulted in 4 problematic factors of the modern One Piece films. The first factor is that the stakes of modern One Piece movies are impossibly high. To get people out of their various abodes, the One Piece films need to promise an event of a higher level, something that the anime or the manga cannot deliver at home. And with modern One Piece movies, that has resulted in stakes that are way too high for One Piece. One Piece is a very large-scale story, and it is slowly working up to one big final war that will almost certainly determine the fate of the world. But that's what we're building up to. By the time we get there, it'll be almost 3 decades reaching that point. And during the time it's taken to get there, even the biggest events in the series tend to have a very local focus. The crew often arrive at an island, and the general story thing is to save the island and its people. That is the highest that stakes get. Whereas when you cut to the One Piece movies, the first modern installment is Strong World, where Golden Lion Shiki's plan was to destroy the entirety of East Blue, which is colossal. Each of the blues individually dwarf the size of the Grand Line and the New World. So what we're looking at is a plan to destroy approximately a quarter of the planet right here. These kind of stakes, while it does create an exciting cinematic experience, are too big for One Piece. And it's not an issue that's hugely apparent in Strong World itself. In isolation, the movie is fine. However, what it did do was raise the bar for each subsequent film to top it. Again, to get people out of their houses, the next film needs to promise something of an even higher level. And the sequels to that then need to promise something greater than that. And that gets pretty immediately tricky when you're talking about destroying a quarter of the planet as your baseline. Which brings us to the next installment, Film Z, which is my personal favorite One Piece movie. And that's despite the fact that it has one of the most ridiculous over-the-top plots ever conceived in this fictional universe, which is that the main antagonist, Zephyr, was planning to destroy the entire New World. The New World is much physically smaller than East Blue. However, it has all of the characters that we like. It is the most powerful sea on the planet at this point, and destroying it is effectively saying that we're just going to destroy the world. So casually plotting to destroy the entire sea very much crosses the line into absurdity, especially with how easy it is for Zephyr to accomplish. And to put this whole destroy the New World thing into perspective, it's currently a very big deal that the world government have access to the ancient weapon Uranus, which has the power to destroy whole islands. That's something that we're supposed to consider a massive game changer. But compared to the schemes of the One Piece movie villains, the primary antagonist of the actual series seems quite underwhelming. What, you can only destroy islands? What's wrong with you? But even Shiki and Zephyr are quite underwhelming compared to what Uta's plan was during Film Red, where she was going to trap an estimated 70% of the world's population in a dream realm for all eternity. And that just makes me wonder where you can possibly go from here. The only possible escalation in the next film would be to threaten 100% of the planet. And when the movies do this, what I dislike most is that it makes all of One Piece feel so small. One of the amazing things about the One Piece world is that no matter how powerful any individual is, the world is simply too big to exert that influence outside of a local empire. But most modern One Piece movie villains break that, and they shrink the world into something so small that a 21-year-old idol girl can casually come up with a plan to destroy. And here's why this is going to continue, because we do have an outlier here. You may have noticed that I skipped a film, and that would be One Piece Film Gold, which was structured more like a standard One Piece arc, localized to a casino island ship city thing. And Gil Tesoro, he was a bad dude with long-term evil plans, but he wasn't imminently threatening to destroy destroy the world, and Film Gold was punished for this lack of ambition as it made $15 million less than Film Z before it, and $27 million less than Stampede after it. Obviously, that's an oversimplification, and there are other factors as to why Film Gold dipped as well. We're going to talk about them in a bit, but look, if I was a One Piece movie film producer following these financial trends, then I'm going to want to replicate the factors and condition that resulted in more money. And one of those key factors is a world-ending threat. But the second key factor is canon bait, which is the practice of a One Piece movie being produced with the promise of revealing relevant canon information and sort of, but not really delivering on that promise. The idea here is to make the movie seem like it's a necessary experience if you want to keep up to date with the story. For example, One Piece Stampede was sold quite heavily on the idea of Douglas Bullet being a former member of the Roger Pirates and learning more about the mystery of Laugh Tale, which at the time was still known as Raftel. And that's what I mean by sort of, but not really delivering, because it was during One Piece Stampede where the fanbase first learned the true name of Raftel being Laugh Tale, something that wouldn't be revealed until a year or so later in the manga, but there was nothing else to it. Bullet being a former Roger Pirate was very hollow, almost completely unexplored, and retrospectively doesn't make any sense at all. However, the best example of this is definitely Film Red, because the canon bait is in the movie title. It was sold as a film about Shanks and finally learning more about the most mysterious character that we've been waiting for ever since chapter 1, and it turned out a lot like Stampede. All we actually learned was his family name Figaland, while everything else was completely hollow and intentionally so. There's a really interesting interview with one of the producers of Film Red, and what he stated was that they had the Red Hair Pirates purposely use false techniques so that they would not spoil the manga. And that's why I call it canon bait. These movies are sold on making you think that something real is going to happen, but they can't actually show you anything because they're not allowed to compromise the manga. And the tiny, teeny small fragments that they do, like Laugh Tale and like Figaland, they do arguably negatively affect reading the manga or the anime watching experience. Because knowing that Raftel is called Laugh Tale takes away the big reveal of chapter 967, where we see Roger find and name the island. And even though it hasn't happened yet, there will come a point where Shanks is revealed to be a member of the Figaland family in the manga, but that will also have very little to no impact because we already know that from the optional film. At least some of us did, because that's another thing to consider. Any canon information revealed in these movies fragments the fanbase. Because every time I bring up that Shanks is a Figaland, I get a sea of comments asking where was this confirmed and if they've missed something in the manga. And the answer is that no, you didn't miss anything, but also you did, but it wasn't your fault. It's just not in the manga yet. And it's kind of annoying that the movies are creating that two-tier experience. Now, in regards to canon bait, Film Gold is again the odd one out here. Strong World was originally built on the idea of being a canon story about Nami's parents. Film Z promised to tell the story of a former Marine Admiral and dig deeper into many of our most beloved canon Marines. But Film Gold said, F it, we're just gonna do our own thing. No canon bait at all here. But again, the movie was financially punished for this because it didn't have that false hook to get people into the cinema. Which is why I don't think that a self-contained adventure like that is ever going to happen again. Because the movies that make the most money are the ones with the biggest canon bait. Again, that's not the sole factor, but it's something that's been shown to be very effective. As has our third factor, which is the overabundance of cameo characters. And many people point to One Piece Stampede as being where this issue began, but it was actually Film Z, because one of the missions of that movie was to cram in as many Marine cameos as possible. Stampede was just the movie that went way overboard. And then Film Red brought things back to a more manageable cameo level, but it was still biting off more than any single film could chew. However, what this does is, again, it gets people into the cinema. A lot of the time, cameo characters are given roles in these movies purely for the ability to put those characters in the trailer and to inflate that sense of scale and depth that the experience is going to have. I think the best example of this is the use of Fleet Admiral Sakazuki specifically. He's in Film Z, Film Gold Stampede, and Film Red, and everything you see of him in those movies is what you've already seen in the trailers. His scenes in those movies are written so that they can be put into marketing material, as are the cameos for most other characters. Very rarely does anyone have something of substance to say or do. Another great example of this is the use of Katakuri in Film Red. He travels all the way to Elegia and you think that he's going to play a big part because he can connect with his sister Brule in the Dream Realm. But as soon as Katakuri arrives, Shanks goes, thanks, but we've already got a guy who can do that over here. And so Katakuri has a completely pointless role in this movie. He exists simply to be. Doesn't really matter though, because he's done his job before you even walk into the cinema by convincing you to do so. That is the most important role he serves. But another major issue with stuffing the movies full of as many characters as possible is that the films already have an incredibly tough task of dealing dealing with 9 to 10 Straw Hat protagonists who all need something to say and do throughout the movie. That is already an incredible challenge for any screenwriter to juggle 9 to 10 protagonists in 90 to 120 minutes. So every character you add on top of that only further dilutes the substance for everyone else. But what I can't deny is that this does make the movies feel like an exciting must-see experience. When you watch the trailer and you see seemingly everyone in the One Piece world colliding for this single event, how can you not have a sense of FOMO at the thought of not getting involved yourself? And to bring up the ever-reliable Film Gold, it is once again the outcast here. Film Gold has a handful of extra characters like Sabo, Rob Lucci, and Spandam, but it focuses mostly on the Straw Hats and the original characters. And for the third time, it got punished at the box office for not cramming in those cameos like Zed before it and Stampede and Film Red after it. I'm not saying that Film Gold is my ideal One Piece movie, because it is very much guilty of our fourth factor, which is the big movie monster. In fact, Film Gold started this. From Film Gold onwards, there has been an over-reliance on creating a giant CG creature for all of the characters to fight, being Golden Giant to Zoro, the aesthetic mess that was the Douglas Bullet monster, and of course Top Musica from Film Red. And again, Film Gold is responsible for this, because after creating a big giant showpiece for that movie, the subsequent ones felt the need to continuously one-up it. They can't go back, and I personally just find them really boring, because it takes the final climax of a movie and makes it as impersonal as it possibly could, and reduces them to being glorified gaming boss battles. They're great allegories for the films themselves, a lot of flashiness going on, but ultimately hollow structures. And I think the movies feel the need to lean on big monsters because the films themselves don't actually have the time to give to their antagonists to begin with. Guild to Zoro and Douglas Bullet are particularly bad because they do have very tragic and compelling backstories, but the movie won't actually tell you that. What you need to do is you need to read the special companion volumes that come out alongside them to find all of that out. And at that point, I'm asking, what even is movie? Because they introduce original characters and then purposely remove any and all content that would actually be used to build those characters in the movie. Probably because they need more space for cameos. And to compensate for that lack of emotional connection with the main villain, the movies need to significantly raise the stakes and rely on whatever CGI mess they can afford to make you forget that they haven't given you an actual character to latch onto. But I gotta be fair here, both Uta in Film Red and Zephyr from Film Z deliver on being solidly explored villains. Which is why it's such a shame that the climax of Film Red has everyone fighting Tot Musica, a magical, personalityless music demon, rather than Uta herself, the person we've been following throughout this whole struggle. And to have everyone stack on Tot Musica feels like we're being robbed of that climax with Uta. And I think there was really something to the climax of Film Z where it was just Luffy and Zephyr knocking each other senseless with no music and minimal sound design. It was a very personal fight, one where each punch was felt, and also one where you didn't necessarily want either of them to lose, because you could empathize with Zephyr. They did such a good job building him because they didn't give all of the screen time to unnecessary cameos. But that empathy is something you couldn't give to Top Musica, Douglas Bullet's Island Monster, or the giant Golden Tesoro. They all fall into the category of mindless spectacle monsters that are designed to be beaten up. And I really do hope that after doing the big movie monster 3 times in a row, the production staff are gonna feel like it's overdone and need to pivot to something else. But considering how financially successful Stampede and especially Film Red were, I think that's only going to encourage the next One Piece movie to also end with a hollow CGI monster, as well as world-ending steak, as well as endless cameos, and most importantly, a huge serving of cannon bait. I'm not sure that the One Piece movies can go back from here. Film Gold tried to keep things more manageable and it just didn't pay off. So I think that they feel the need to keep finding new ways to escalate. Personally, and this helps me a lot when walking into these, I don't consider the One Piece movies to be actual movies. I consider them to be like events, like say going into a convention or watching a sports match. You're not there expecting a story. You're there to experience the atmosphere with like-minded people, and that's why the best way to watch these movies are in the cinema, because they just don't hit the same in your living room without a few hundred people cheering every time a familiar character shows up on screen. Because the one undeniable thing is that as much as I vent on the internet, every time I've seen a One Piece film in a cinema, it has been an amazing experience. And so long as they provide that experience, then who really cares about any of the things it is that I just said? One Piece filler is bad, like really bad. It's so bad they made a whole new definition for the word in the anime dictionary. However, there is a single improbably great filler arc in One Piece known as G8. This, frankly speaking, should not exist. It is a rare example of an anime filler arc that is considered better than some canon arcs. And the reason for this has to do with the story behind its creation, including the fact that it was once intended to be its own feature film, and the philosophy of rejecting everything that we typically knew about One Piece. This is the story of G8, the arc that shouldn't exist. Now, as a quick TLDR, after leaving Skypiea, the Straw Hats fall back down to the Blue Sea smack bang in the middle of the G8 Marine base on Navarone Island. The premise of this arc is that the Straw Hats need to split up and infiltrate the base in order to find a way to escape, get into some hilarious shenanigans, change the lives of some people along the way, all whilst being pursued by the primary antagonist, Vice Admiral Jonathan, a highly intelligent tactician who manages to predict their every move. And there's one more key thing to note about the base itself. G8 is a base that has seen better days. It's very much the black sheep of the Marines. People look down on it, they no longer see it as necessary, and there is a push to have the entire base decommissioned. So a massive part of this arc is also about meeting the staff at G8, empathizing with them, and actually rooting for them to have this base saved, because they're mostly a bunch of good-natured people down on their luck, and they could really use something to turn things around. Like, say, capturing the 100 million berry pirate captain that just fell into their laps. That's the first key point of difference with this filler arc. The location itself is a character. It feels lived in, it has a culture, and even though it's our enemy, we want to save it. Whereas most filler arcs take place in completely generic and forgettable locations, which you can always kind of tell don't belong in the One Piece world. And the same goes for the original characters in most filler arcs. However, the very first episode of G8 barely shows the Straw Hats at all. It's a compelling mystery following the Marines of Navarone. There's a few main perspective points, each with their own goals and unique relationships with other staff on the island, and there's just such a level of thought and care put into this location and its characters that does not exist elsewhere in One Piece filler. And I can tell you the reason for this. The really fun thing about this filler arc is that it was originally intended to be the story for one of the One Piece films at the time. It's never been stated which, but judging by the release timing, my guess is that it was either considered for movie 4, which ended up being Dead End Adventure, which came out a year before G8 hit the anime, that, or it could have been considered for movie 5, which became The Cursed Holy Sword, which came out the same year as G8. And I have differing opinions on history based on which movie it was going to replace. If it was Dead End Adventure, then it was 100% the right call to move G8 to the anime. However, if it was for movie 5, then I think they maybe should have canned that and given G8 a full theatrical release. But I think that's what elevates G8, because it was a story originally created as premium bonus content rather than a filler experience. When they came up with the story of G8, it had the job of getting people out of their houses and into a cinema, instead of having the job of delaying their weekly experience, which they get to enjoy from the comfort of their own homes. So there was a lot of care put into creating a premise, a story, and original characters worth paying money and going outside to see. G8 is also by far the longest filler arc in One Piece, and thankfully it's also the best, otherwise it would be completely insufferable. But G8 is a masterclass on how to handle filler in a series like One Piece, which I often describe as the perfect mixture of action, drama, and comedy. This is a formula that sounds so simple. It's only 3 things, but in this world, only the author Eiichiro Oda is truly capable of blending those features seamlessly. The problem with most anime filler is that they usually suck when it comes to drama, because the anime writers can't produce a hard-hitting story on the same level as Oda, and that's not entirely their fault. It's also an issue with them only receiving a handful of episodes to write a dramatic story on par with massive One Piece arcs. It just can't really be done without feeling shallow, because they're not allowed the depth of time. Secondly, the filler action usually sucks because for most of its lifespan, the anime feels really lost when it doesn't have Oda's manga choreography to work with. I should say that's changed these days, particularly in the recent years, because Toei have hired a lot of talented freelance animators that frequently make filler action just as, if not more compelling than the canon action, but we're talking back in the early 2000s. And back then, filler that focused heavily on action also tended to fail because it just felt so boring and uninspiring. They couldn't do original action. Which leaves us with comedy, and this, in my opinion, is the only thing that filler can truly excel at. Because as long as you know the characters, comedy can be written quite naturally. It also doesn't require the animation skills and the vision that action scenes do. And also, with quick gags, you don't need the depth of episodes to produce comedy in the same way that you need that time when it comes to drama. So for One Piece filler to be successful, in my opinion, the strategy is to heavily focus on comedy, to reduce action wherever possible, and mate, don't even try to touch a hard-hitting dramatic story. But also, you can't have no action and no drama. You gotta have a little bit of something, and that is the beautiful balance that G8 hits. G8 does have the looming concern of the morale amongst the staff at the base due to the threat of it being decommissioned, but the Straw Hats also have their own driving force, which is that they need to recover their gold which was taken from the Marines when they landed in the base so that they can use it to repair the Going Merry, which they consider a crew member. So it's not overly dramatic, but it sets up a wonderful two-sided conflict. The Marines, they need to catch those Straw Hat pirates to prove that their base is worth keeping around and raise the morale of everyone and prove that G8 is useful. But the Straw Hats, they need to not have that happen to them. They need to escape so that they can save their ship friend. Although that's definitely quite a bittersweet plot point in retrospect. But I want to talk about Vice Admiral Jonathan in particular, because One Piece filler tends to go all or nothing when it comes to antagonists. They either try to make someone who is an actual threat to the Straw Hats but never, feels quite right, or they don't even try at all and they make the antagonist a complete joke. But Vice Admiral Jonathan is in a league of his own, not just for filler antagonists but One Piece antagonists in general. We've never seen anyone quite like him, and even now 20 years later, if I rewatch G8, he still feels refreshing. The really fun thing about Jonathan is that he's a major antagonist who Luffy never fights. In fact, Jonathan himself doesn't physically fight at all during G8, which gives us something we almost never see with the Marines, which is a focus on tactics and strategy. Jonathan's battle against the Straw Hats is one of mind games, and Jonathan is at least one step ahead of the crew at every stage of the arc, and it turns out that he's using them for his own purpose. Jonathan's relationship with Luffy is something that I would love to see happen in the actual series, because he and Luffy are kind of bizarrely on the same wavelength. For example, this is a genuine conversation that happens between them during G8. I told you I'll leave when I want to leave. Indeed. So, do you want to leave right now? Yeah, I'm gonna leave right now. Yeah, okay. There's no animosity between Luffy and Jonathan at all. In fact, Luffy treats Jonathan more like a friend he's having fun with than an enemy. And it turns out that Jonathan's doing much the same thing. Because the big twist of G8 is that Jonathan was never really trying to capture the Straw Hats. I mean, he wasn't exactly trying to not capture them, but instead he was using them as a jolt to inspire the personnel of the base, to bring them together as a team and essentially revive what was a dying branch of the Marines. Jonathan saw the morale of G8 as the greater pursuit of justice as opposed to capturing the 100 million berry man. He valued the morale of his staff more than he did the money and the personal fame of capturing Luffy. He's genuinely one of the best Marines we've ever met in the series, canon or non-canon, which is interesting because there are a couple of retrospective plot holes about Jonathan. The most obvious is that he is said to be a protege of and has a close relationship to Admiral Akainu, retrospectively implying that Jonathan is a follower of absolute justice, which he is demonstrably the exact opposite of. But this was definitely not the intention of the production staff. Remembering that this was 2004, so the manga had only just gotten to Water 7 and we'd never even met Akainu. However, we did know his name because he and Kizaru were mentioned when Kuzan appears on Long Ring Longland. Long Ring Longland also had yet to happen in the anime at this point, so what the anime staff did was they used this future information to create some intrigue, but without knowing who this character would actually turn out to be. And because G8 comes right before Long Ring Longland in the anime, I think this means that Akainu is the first admiral mentioned in the anime. The funny thing is, if they'd chosen Kizaru or even Aokiji, then Jonathan would fit perfectly into the One Piece world because both Unclear Justice and Lazy Justice suit him brilliantly. So this was a bit of an unlucky pick for the anime staff. And he also comes with all of the early One Piece Vice Admiral disclaimers, like the fact that we now know that all Vice Admirals have to be capable of using Haki, and every time the anime created an original Vice Admiral, they all now seem unbelievably weak for their ranks, like Gaspard, the main antagonist of movie 4. But this really makes me want to see a One Piece spin-off focused on a character like Jonathan. Someone who is less of a combatant and more of a leader, or even better, a detective, like he is in the first episode, solving mysteries about the ship that fell from the sky, like a special marine agency that travels around the world solving strange pirate crimes. Meanwhile, the role of the more stereotypical evil filler antagonist is also present in Commander Shepard, almost certainly known better to most of you watching as Straw Hat crew member Condoriano. Meeting Condoriano was the moment I knew that G8 was going to be something very special. Condoriano is a man who arrives at the G8 base at the same time as the Straw Hats fall into it, and his identity is assumed by Robin so that she can find information to help the crew escape, which is something that Usopp masterfully notices and assists in this effort by claiming that Shepard is part of the Straw Hats, a very special Nakama named Condoriano. And from that moment on, everyone refers to him as Condoriano. The Straw Hats, the Marines, Jonathan, the fans. And I think it's fair to say that Condoriano has been the single most impactful filler character on the One Piece fanbase, because he is still mentioned to this very day, and in some particular memesome circles, he is is considered a spiritual Straw Hat because this lie was told by Usopp, and as we all know, every lie that Usopp tells eventually comes true. So I think this is why Yamato couldn't join the crew, because we're still keeping that final slot open for the day that Condoriano decides to return to us. His role is very Shakespearean comedy, deriving hilarity from misunderstandings. And Condoriano, he is just the perfect foil. He's a character who you have to handle very carefully as well, because less skilled writers would be in danger of overusing the gag and turning it into something lazy, potentially even annoying. But like most of G8, they hit a perfect balance with him. And just briefly, the rest of the characters are also fantastic. Jessica is the head chef of G8 who Sanji simps over, even though she's married to Jonathan, and learns some very important lessons from Sanji, who she considers more of a cook than a pirate. There's also a very sweet story with the mechanic Macau, who admires the Going Merry and all of the love that Usopp has put into repairing it, even though it's so haphazard, and so he decides to help the Straw Hats because of their obvious love for their ship, as well as it being reciprocated, because he gives us our first hint to the spirit of the Going Merry, the Clobotoman. And also his daughter Kobato, a pediatrician with hemophilia who happens to be the only doctor on duty and comes to learn a lot from and greatly respect the skills and attitude of Chopper. All of these are fantastic because they show us something that we never really see in One Piece, which are Marine faction members who are not soldiers, and how even though they're aligned with the Marines, they each struggle with their own individual definition of justice. These are not the battle-hardened warriors determined to wipe out all evil in the world. These are just the regular people doing the regular jobs, the ones that the Marines are in theory fighting for, and I think it's incredibly fitting that these are the figures who determine the outcome of this arc, because without their help, the Straw Hats would not have succeeded. But in general, G8 also tends to work really well because it focuses on the lesser shown crew members. For example, Luffy and Zoro during this arc, completely useless. And if anything, they're an active hindrance on the crew. And because there's no big call for action, G8 focuses on highlighting the skills of the more technical Straw Hats. Nami, Usopp, and Chopper in particular are huge driving forces of this arc, and it really shows just how diverse the skill set of the crew is when there's a problem that cannot be punched, sliced, or kicked. And one of the reasons why I highly recommend watching G8 if you're watching the anime through for the first time is because it gives you a bit more time with Robin. It continues to show us just how incredibly useful she is and gives us more insight into her personal experience. She shows us a lot more of those underworld skills that she's acquired after being on the run for 20 years. And given that the entire next saga centers around her, it really does not hurt to have a bit more time to bond with Robin on a low-stakes crew adventure before heading into something incredibly dramatic. Meanwhile, something else I love about G8 is that it doesn't even try to introduce new devil fruit users, which is very wise because filler devil fruits are almost always horrible. The reason for this is because in order to use an original fruit in filler, the staff need to submit that idea to Oda, making sure that he isn't planning to use something similar down the line. And as a result of this, the ideas that Oda does approve are usually the bottom of the barrel of the fruit market powers that not even he would consider implementing in the series even as a joke. So filler episodes are kind of like a sieve but designed to filter out all the quality. And I think that not having any new devil fruit users actually forces the writers to focus on building characters in other ways, to give them personalities as opposed to gimmicks. Filler characters with devil fruits are usually extremely gimmicky, one-dimensional, and overly reliant on that one thing it is that they have. But G8 actually takes the path of building characters, which I really appreciate. But let's be real. G8 is not perfect, and this is still a filler arc. There are definitely some annoying things about it, one of which is that, mate, there is filler in my filler. There's a scene where the crew are preparing to recover their gold and all sharing their favorite memories of Mary, but it's just an excuse to put minutes upon minutes of clips into the episodes to pad for time. And it's really bizarre because in this case, the canon material is acting like filler in my filler, and I want the canon stuff to go away so that I can get more filler. The canon material is ruining my filler material, and I think that's actually a huge compliment to G8. It's so good that I want the filler story to continue, and I'm actively annoyed by canon. However, I should say that there's a general lack of creativity every time that the crew are forced to engage in combat with the Marines. Like I said, filler, it doesn't do good action, and that is made unfortunately clear at a lot of moments during this arc. The Straw Hats tend to get caught in the same sort of trap over and over again, where the Marines fire at Luffy bounces the bullets back, and then the Marines try the exact same thing next time and act all surprised when it doesn't work. Although to be fair, Luffy never learns either, because the Marines also have a special sea stone net that Luffy gets caught in a lot and never learns to avoid. The choreography is pretty rubbish as well, and G8 is definitely strongest when we avoid open conflict and we need to sneak around and focus on intrigue. In terms of the sneaking, the stealth focus of this arc actually plays quite well into the concept of filler, because stealth tension deliberately slows us down and doesn't make it feel like the anime is padding too much, because the genre of the arc plays into the mission of of the filler. So it's not perfect, but mate, this arc is better than it has any right to be. Going back and re-watching G8, which I do, always makes me think that I should invest more time into the other One Piece filler arcs, but then I remember what the other filler arcs are and then I just sort of move on with my life. And unfortunately, I don't think you could do this kind of story in One Piece these days. The Straw Hats are just too powerful to not immediately be able to solve a problem like this. So G8 acts as a lovely time capsule of a long past era, but even 2 decades later, it holds up shockingly well, and in my opinion provides a more entertaining experience than a lot of the post-timeskip canon anime that is plagued by inbuilt filler and takes every opportunity to slow down the story, rather than do something like G8. Tell a story designed to be slow and that takes advantage of the lesser focused qualities of this world and its characters. Eiichiro Oda made a YouTuber quit his job because he hates One Piece theories, and he especially hates people who make One Piece theories on the internet. Well, this puts me in a bit of an awkward position, because this has become quite a big story and quite a massive overreaction to a sprinkling of misinformation. So let's get into the drama, and this all started with a tweet from Mr. Sandman on Twitter saying, "A few days ago on Shimofuri Seiya's radio program, it was revealed that Eiichiro Oda dislikes having the future developments of One Piece predicted by theorists." After hearing Oda's remarks, Yuderon, a well-known Japanese One Piece YouTuber, announced his retirement. Now, a lot of you will have heard of Yuderon before. I've referenced him on this channel, and he is, or I guess he was, a content creator who focused on One Piece theories and analysis, and he's actually the one responsible for coming up with the core idea behind one of the most successful videos in our entire niche, being Ohara's The Best One Piece Theory You'll Ever Watch, I guess, which was made about 4 years ago now, and very much changed the entire trajectory of English-speaking One Piece content on YouTube. So it's very hard to overstate the impact that Yuderon has had on this platform in this niche, even if you've never heard of him. And so you can imagine that it must have come as quite an unpleasant shock to Yuderon to hear Eiichiro Oda state how much he actively dislikes what he does, and hence why Yuderon is retiring. Or at least that's the narrative that formed as a result of this. The actual story is a lot more complicated. There's a lot of misinformations, misconceptions, and a lot of people who are getting weirdly angry at something that may not necessarily exist. And yet another case of pointing out that you shouldn't just immediately trust whatever it is you read on the internet. And let's begin with the figure who reported this, a Sandman. He is a, how shall we say, slightly controversial figure in the One Piece fan base. What I will say for him is that Sandman is an absolutely invaluable source to English-speaking fans, because he goes out of his way to hunt down and translate these incredibly obscure interviews with Oda, as well as his former One Piece editors, and they have given us such a profound insight into Oda's minds that I have cited countless times in my videos. And a lot of this information comes from the late 90s or the early to mid 2000s. This was back when Eiichiro Oda used to do a lot of interviews, none of which are online. They were printed in magazines and stuff. And Sandman, he tracks all of this stuff down and translates it for us. Very good stuff. However, he can also be a bit polarizing because of the way that he words a lot of these translations, which can sometimes feel deliberately incendiary. And I do believe that this is one of those occasions. I wouldn't go so far as to say that he does this on purpose to troll people, as others would suggest, but English isn't his first language, and sometimes I think Sandman conveys information with a different implication than what was originally intended. And on this occasion, I believe a mistake was made with the tweet, because the way that Sandman worded it makes it sound like a quote from Oda, when in fact Oda wasn't even on this radio show at all. This was an acquaintance of Oda speaking, and what he actually said was very different from what was reported. So for context, there were 2 people on this program, and one brought up that the other used to make One Piece theories on YouTube and asked how many of them were accurate. And this is a response to that question translated by Manu from the Ohara channel. "Some things haven't been revealed yet, but it's hard to say how much I can talk about it. I mean, I kind of know Oda-sensei now. Calling him a friend would be overdoing it, but we message online. He's like a god of manga. So if someone he messages is out there doing fan theories, that might feel unpleasant. Yes, I kind of stopped doing them. Apparently, he doesn't really like them too much." So this already gives a completely different impression, because you got a bunch of people running around on the internet right now yelling about how Oda hates One Piece theories, and it's all based on not even hearsay, because this guy isn't quoting Oda or conveying anything that Oda told him personally. What he's expressing is a vibe. He says apparently he doesn't really like them too much. And I'm 99.9% sure that this impression comes comes from an actual statement made by Oda, and this was all the way back in 2021. Specifically the SBS of volume 101, Oda was asked by a reader if he watches any One Piece YouTubers, and Oda replied with, "I know they exist and I have actually watched a number of them. I am surprised. Everyone is really detailed, and the theories too. They actually predict future stories, so I stopped watching them, lol. It's dangerous for me to consider all of my readers to be at that level. After all, there are plenty of casual readers too. I need to draw One Piece so that it can be enjoyed by anyone. Seeing people that understand things so well will corrupt me, lol. I don't have to explain stuff here, they'll get it. So yeah, I won't be checking anyone, just get along and enjoy." So you can start to see where some pretty heavy misconceptions come from. It's not that Oda doesn't like fan theories and fan discussion, he's actually a little bit in awe of it and how accurate some of it can be. It's just that he doesn't like reading and engaging with it himself. Oda worries that if he engages too much or at all in that One Piece fan theory culture, then it will, quote, corrupt him and hinder his ability to draw a story for everyone. Because as he's writing, he'll be considering the hardcore fictional pirate fans on the internet too much, rather than the average person in Japan who picks up a copy of Weekly Shonen Jump every week at a konbini. Or say the average person in the US bringing up Manga Plus on their phone and reading a chapter on their way to work. And so if Oda gets too involved in that hardcore fan culture, then he'll begin to assume a level of common knowledge that is in fact rather uncommon or even rare, and his writing will become impenetrable for a more casual fan who doesn't at all times remember every little thing that's happened over the past 3 decades. And what's quite remarkable about Oda, and I guess One Piece in general, is how accessible it is to anyone who picks up any random chapter and that's their first experience of the series. And that's part of the not so secret formula that has made One Piece the most popular and highest selling manga series in human history. That level of accessibility for casual fans. And then there's that optional range of depth for the crazy obsessive Australian men who spend 7 days a week writing, recording, and editing videos about these fictional pirates. And this is actually something that I myself have to consider a lot. I generally try not to assume that viewers of this channel have too much knowledge, because you're all incredibly intelligent and, may I say, aesthetically appealing individuals, but you guys have got your own lives to live. I'm sure you're doing your own things, which leads me to repeating myself a lot across videos because I try not to make the assumption that everyone has a certain level of knowledge, even if I've said something in a previous video, because a new viewer won't necessarily have watched that previous video. I go and say it again, so I do get where Oda's coming from here. I also think it is possible to be, well, his word is corrupted, but I think it is very possible to be corrupted by the theories of others. So I try to limit the intake of other One Piece content that I watch from other One Piece creators so that I can keep my opinions mostly my own. Because if you watch enough content, eventually your thoughts are going to be, at least subconsciously, affected by the media you consume. So again, I 100% get where Oda's coming from here, and the absolute last thing I would want him to do is watch a bunch of our videos and start to be subtly influenced by that, because whatever we're spewing from our mouths is not as good as what's going to come out of his brain. So it's definitely the best thing for One Piece and for Oda to remain in his bubble, which has served us so well for so long. And again, that doesn't mean that he doesn't like fan theories or fan culture. It's just that he doesn't want the story to be in any way compromised by it, and neither do I. So in that regard, I do think that Sandman has done quite a disservice by not making the context of what was said clear, namely that it was not Oda's words, it was not him being interviewed, and secondly that it was also completely speculation from the speaker, almost certainly based on the SBS answer that I read out. But things get slightly more complicated when we get back to Yuderon, who did indeed retire after the show was broadcast. And he did cite this comment as one of the reasons why, but it was not the primary reason. Yuderon was in fact retiring because his channel just wasn't getting the views required to make it a worthwhile endeavor. And if you look at his channel, you'll see a lot of videos that are getting around 20,000 views on average, sometimes less, sometimes more. And to be completely blunt, that's just not enough to sustain a career. Not with the length of his videos, and not with his posting frequency, which was about once a week. I know that 20,000 views sounds like a lot. 20,000 is so many, you could fill a small stadium with that many people, but most YouTubers don't make anywhere near as much money as people think, especially not ones in this niche. If you're talking about beauty, fitness, or personal finance, then that's a different matter. But fictional pirates, I mean, I think Yuderon could probably make it work if he posted maybe 5 to 7 times a week, but that is such an insane amount of work. And the other incredibly important reason he cited for his retirement was his actual life. Things were getting very busy, and making One Piece videos wasn't really feasible anymore. And so hearing this comment on a radio show was more a case of convenient timing. It gave Yuderon the final permission to say goodbye. But the way that Sandman worded it made it sound like Oda hates theories, and it is such a profound dislike that it essentially forced a One Piece YouTuber to quit. That is, unfortunately, the narrative that spawned from this, in reality, kind of nothing statement, which also isn't helped by YouTubers who jumped onto this a bit too quickly, like say Chibi Reviews, who made a video 5 hours after Sandman's Twitter post about how horrible of a take this was from Oda. How dare he say this? Which is particularly crazy because Chibi Reviews also played Yuderon's videos with subtitles in his video, but I guess didn't watch it all the way through to find out the real reason why he was retiring, nor did he try to confirm whether or not Oda actually said the thing that his entire video was about. He just assumed, and not to single him out because he was far from the only one, but he was definitely one of the bigger presences to do what I describe as jumping for the treat. And what that means is, essentially, I have 2 dogs, and when I offer a treat, one of those dogs is extremely skeptical and takes a bit of time to review the situation, including such factors as whether or not I actually have a treat in my hand before deciding to jump. Whereas the other dog will immediately jump at the mere concept of treat. There's no thinking, it's all doing, and sometimes that really doesn't work out for her. There's a lot of that happening here. Too many people jumping for the treat without thinking first. But this toothpaste isn't going back into whatever the toothpaste comes out of, and this narrative has already spread, hitting many One Piece fan nexuses or nexi, such as the One Piece subreddit, and of course the Piratefolk subreddit. In case you don't know what Piratefolk is, that's where One Piece fans go to be miserable. And so, we have the following thread. Oda made a Japanese One Piece theorist quit his YouTube channel for doing theories on his story. So let me get this straight, Oda. You create a manga that goes on for 25 years in a weekly magazine and cultivated this loud fan base of smart ales. People stroke you and suck you off because of your world building, the foreskinning, the lore, and the mysteries, and now you hate the idea of people in your country engaging with your world by uncovering its mysteries and characters? Is Oda exposing himself as a dumbass? As it turns out, Oda isn't, but the person who posted this thread is, as well as the, this is crazy, 1,500 people who upvoted it, and also most of the 400 or so comments reacting to it. It's a sign of an insecure writer, Imo. People coming up with better reveals, thus making you look like the hack you are. A multi-million-dollar writer that cares about theories random shitters on the net make about his story, whose videos aren't even seen by 0.5% of the fandom, is pretty pathetic, NGL. Oda is an idiot if he doesn't realize that his manga is one of the highest selling graphic comics of all time, and folks are going to engage with his material and analyze the shit out of it. People will always theorize based on how the story is written. He has no one to blame but himself. And just to reiterate, because this is extremely important, all of these people are getting angry and miserable over something that never actually happened. Oda never said this, but because this has spread so far, it's now going to become one of those fan-based myths. There's already quite a few of these myths that are almost always based on bad translations of an interview, and I don't think this one gets spread quite as much anymore, but when I first started reading and watching One Piece, it was a very common myth to say that if a human ate Chopper's devil fruit, then they would achieve enlightenment, which was based on a confusing comical non-answer that Oda gave to that question in an SBS that was horrendously translated back in the day. And another one of those myths that's actually quite relevant to this topic is that allegedly, Oda once said that if any fan managed to predict the ending to One Piece, then he would actively go out of his way to change it. I see this one brought up a lot, and it's actually re-emerged with this discussion, and so now what we've got are myths turning into a compound myth. The idea being that Oda doesn't want to have to go out of his way to change the ending, so he's trying to Leloucia all One Piece theorists out of existence before any of them discover it. But weirdly enough, there is a bit more truth to this one though. Oda did in fact say this in 2019 during an appearance on Fuji TV. I believe the show was called Honmadeka, which is a very classical kind of Japanese chat show, and it's where we learned a lot of very cool stuff, such as Oda having a whopping 10 assistants that work with him on drawing One Piece, which is apparently what you need to bring to life such a wildly detailed manga weekly. It's also where Oda revealed that he only sleeps for 3 hours a day, which is apparently from 9 AM to midday. And because this was from so long ago, they also hilariously ask Oda if One Piece is going to be over 100 volumes. And as of recording this video, we're currently at 111. But the host of this show then went on to ask what would happen if a fan managed to guess the ending of One Piece. And Oda jokingly replied that he would have to change the ending, which Anime News Network picked up and ran with, publishing this statement as if it was made in all seriousness and unleashing this myth onto the fan base. But look, there is an interesting discussion to be had on the topic of whether or not One Piece theories are actually getting very close to hitting the mark, and whether or not somebody already accurately predicted big reveals being saved for the end of the series, because as we get more and more information in the final saga, these pieces are coming together. It's like playing Hangman. When you filled in enough letters, eventually the word becomes easy to guess. And I don't think we're quite at that stage yet, but a point will come in a couple of years where we've got enough information that someone somewhere is going to make a theory that pretty much spoils the end of One Piece, which is a very bizarre place for our online culture to be in. For most of its lifespan, the appeal of One Piece theories has been the infinite potential, that there's so much left to explore and to be done, that people were having a lot of fun exploring crazy ideas and connections. But gradually, as One Piece prepares to wrap up, fans are being funneled into increasingly common tunnels of thought, because the possibilities for the future have significantly narrowed, as is expected when a story starts to reach its end. And it's definitely a lot harder to come up with interesting and unique theories than it used to be. And now a lot of speculation tends to center around trying to predict when exactly the end of One Piece will be, rather than all the crazy crap that's going to happen along the way. But look, again, I don't think we're quite at that point yet. However, there may come a time in the future where One Piece theory videos do genuinely turn into One Piece spoiler videos. But you let me know what you think about all of this, and in fact, let me know what you think about anything you want in the comments below. Toei hates Sanji. There has been a concerted effort within Toei Animation to portray Sanji very differently in the One Piece anime than he has been in the manga, which has resulted primarily in diminishing his strength, amping up his pervy qualities, and most crazily of all, deliberately making Zoro look cooler, ever so cooler, to make Sanji look worse by comparison. That is the theory that I'm seeing online, and have been seeing for quite some time now, particularly during the Egghead era of the anime, and I've mostly shrugged it off as the ramblings of Reddit and the tempestuousness of Twitter. That is until recently when I started really looking into it. And as it turns out, there is indeed a very consistent effort put into undermining Sanji's adaptation in the One Piece anime. Whether this is on purpose or not is a question that we will answer shortly. However, I can confirm that this effect is very much real. And as the most unbiased source on the internet, I have chosen myself to investigate this. Pay no attention to the other life-size Zoro in the background there. Look, unbiased people have life-size statues for characters they feel completely neutral about all the time. And if you have a problem with it, then I think that you are the biased one and you disgust me. But let's kick off with an example in episode 1046, which contained one of my favorite Wano moments, which is when Zoro and Sanji simultaneously kick and sword into action against King and Queen, whilst Marco says it's time for the stars to take the stage. I still genuinely get chills thinking about it. For the wings of the Pirate King to take flight and soar onto the world stage for the very first time. It's so good. However, if you watched the anime adaptation of this event, then you'll know that things were done a little bit differently. Right before Marco's line about the stars taking the stage, there is a slow, lingering shot of Zoro epicsomely emerging from his bandages, looking amazing as he always does. And then what Marco says is, "Here comes the star, singular. Here comes the singular star." After which point, Zoro alone leaps over Marco to attack. Whereas in the manga, Zoro and Sanji both attack simultaneously. And what all of this does is make it look like Marco was just referring to Zoro. Here comes the star. And we're very much ignoring that Sanji is also there. Now, I do think that this is pretty egregious, but it's not entirely Toei's fault. The line in Japanese is the same in the manga as the anime, so the fault here does also lie with the English translator, because Japanese is a very tricksy language. It often doesn't differentiate between singular or plural, and so you need to understand exactly what the words are referring to by the context in which they are used. So for example, the Viz translator Stephen Paul, he understood that Marco was talking about both Zoro and Sanji, but the anime sub-translator clearly thought that it was just Zoro, star, singular, implying that they're probably not a One Piece manga reader. But also, it's really hard to blame them for translating it as star singular, because the entire scene as portrayed by Toei is all about hyping up Zoro. In the manga, Zoro and Sanji are given equal panel time in this moment, but in the anime, they linger on Zoro a lot, both before and after Marco's line. And the reason for this is because they need to add in filler material wherever possible, because the Toei anime only covers one chapter per episode, sometimes less, and without all of these little creative additions, episodes would probably only be about 12 minutes long, opening and ending included. So Toei objectively created the wrong impression of this scene, because even the person who was hired to translate it thought that the scene was all about Zoro. And it definitely does diminish this moment, which should be about both wings, but instead we're talking about a very lopsided bird because we're only focusing on one wing. And at this point, I imagine that a lot of people are watching this video and calling me some sort of pedantic man on the internet because this is a small thing, but in my opinion, it's a small thing that makes a big difference. And if it was just one small thing, I wouldn't even be making this video. But these micro decisions very consistently add up, and they add up not in Sanji's favor. So during Egghead Island, there was a need for filler in both Zoro and Sanji fights. In Zoro's case, that was Zoro versus S-Hawk, and for Sanji, it was his fight against S-Shark. His first fight, I should say, because there are multiple. And this is a very good case study because things are about as equal as we could hope. One wing of the Pirate King versus one seraph of the Seraphim. And in Zoro's case, the filler he's given is one of the most exquisitely crafted sequences in the entire history of the One Piece anime. It is so stunningly choreographed, expertly animated, and it makes Zoro look nothing less than phenomenal. Because not only does he take no damage, he's also got the handicap of carrying around Kaku, and he's doing it all so stylishly. It honestly makes Zoro look a lot more capable than I think he actually is, because S-Hawk, he's basically a mini Mihawk. This is an amazing feat, and it's not being performed by the man who's supposed to have amazing feat. Because if we take a look at Sanji's filler, where he gets choked out by S-Shark and thrown against a wall in a very not amazingly animated scene, this makes Sanji look a lot less capable than he actually is. Because in the manga, this scene does not exist. There is no point at which he struggles against S-Shark at all. He fights S-Shark twice, and he does very well in both encounters. And so I think this does display the general Toei mindset when it comes to these filler editions. Zoro is viewed as this grand showcase piece. Every morsel of Zoro filler is an opportunity to draw and animate something amazing. The animators are salivating over the opportunity, whereas Sanji is more of a ragdoll. He's what you get to do when you don't get the Zoro scene. So where Zoro exists to be enhanced, Sanji exists to be diminished. And this general Toei mindset was confirmed in the filler of 1124. To briefly explain the context of this for non-manga readers, there is an overnight time skip during Egghead Island, after which point we cut back to the Straw Hats having captured York and the Seraphim, and we never find out how exactly this happened. We just see the aftermath. To this day, we still have no idea what canonically happened during that evening, but the anime decided to go and fill in some of those gaps. What they did is they wrote their version of what happened during that night, and they did so in a rather predictable way. What happened, according to Toei, is that Kaku found himself going up against two Seraphim, S-Bear and S-Hawk, and he had to be saved by Zoro, who swished in, beat both of them at once, and was very, very cool whilst doing it. Whereas according to Toei, what happened to Sanji is that he went up against one Seraphim, and he had to be saved by Nami. Not that there's anything wrong with being saved by Nami, but it is very interesting how Toei decided to write their version of these events, where Zoro's a smooth Giga Chad Alpha, easily taking on two Seraphim at once, while Sanji was forced to his knees by S-Shark, looking honestly quite pathetic in this still they made for him. This episode is actually what tipped me into the camp that maybe there is something to this Toei hates Sanji theory, because it does seem like they take every opportunity to make Zoro look better and make Sanji look worse. And it's not just action either, because Toei also heavily exaggerates Sanji's simp gags. For example, there's a scene in chapter 1075 where Sanji's all over Stussy, reminiscing about that time he met Stussy at his own wedding, and really probably should have had his eyes elsewhere on that of all days. But Sanji then goes full Sanji and asks Stussy if she will let him be her dog. And so with that in mind, I don't really know how much I can blame what Toei did here, because Oda did really give license for it. But in the manga, Stussy kind of shrugs this off with a laugh and gets everyone right back on task. And one difference with the anime is Sanji's dialogue. They added an extra line where he says from the moment he saw Stussy, which again was on his own wedding day, he's been Stussy's servant. And after she says her line, Sanji starts acting like a literal dog with hard eyes, hopping and drooling and balking and performing all sorts of fun tricks. And stuff like this comes from the same core problem of the One Piece anime that I always bang on about, and I've already mentioned a couple of times in this video and will mention a couple of times again. It comes from a need for filler. Because the anime cannot fill 20-minute episodes with only a single chapter, they've got to look at each and every panel in that single chapter and think about how to extend all of the scenes. And in the case of this panel, they looked at it and thought, well, what if Sanji actually did start acting like a dog? And even though he's the one who suggested it in the manga, the anime does make him look slightly worse by having him actually do it. Although to be fair, I don't think it's out of character for Sanji. If Stussy had said this in the manga, then he 100% would have done this, in my opinion. But there is one very recent anime filler scene that is very out of character. At the end of episode 1123, Sanji approached Jewelry Bonnie with a plate of pancakes, simping over her with his traditional heart eyes, which he does with every woman. But it's a bit of a weird moment because Jewelry Bonnie Bonnie is actually 12 years old. Now, a couple of things about this. Firstly, this scene is not in the manga. Secondly, in Sanji's defense, he does not know that she's a child at this point. And realistically, I do think this is what he would do. Sanji sees woman, Sanji sims for woman. And in fact, when it was first confirmed that Bonnie was a child, the very first thought I had was, oh, Sanji, you, my boy, have made some very big mistakes. But then I looked back on every scene of Sanji and Bonnie interacting, and I noticed that he never once did his classic heart eyes simp routine with her in any way. And that's because Eiichiro Oda, I imagine, was very well aware of what he was doing and probably didn't want to put Sanji in that situation of lusting after a child, even if she had an adult body. It's just, it's messy. It's so much easier to avoid the issue altogether. And so the in-world explanation is now that Sanji's natural radar filtered Bonnie out. He didn't know that she was a child, but his natural system did not recognize Bonnie as a target for physical affection. And so I think that Toei have done Sanji really dirty on 2 counts here. Firstly, because unlike us reading at the time, they know what's coming with Bonnie. And this is a scene that just didn't need to exist. It doesn't exist. They made it up. And so they made an active choice for Sanji to go into this lust mode. But our second count is that Oda made a conscious decision never to depict Sanji doing this with Bonnie. And so even if it does sound unrealistic, I do think that Toei have actively gone against the intentions of the author by making this filler scene. And it should be said that this is not the first time they've had Sanji do something like this in relation to a child as in filler. In One Piece Film Z, we had a reverse Bonnie situation where Nami was physically aged down by the powers of the Motomoto no Mi, and so she spent a lot of the film with the body of an 8-year-old, which the rest of the crew saw as a crisis, but Sanji, in his Winston Churchill wisdom of never wasting a crisis, saw this as an opportunity. He mused that this would mean he'd be able to, quote, closely observe Nami's precious days while her body matures, which is definitely the creepiest line in the entire One Piece franchise, and it was given to one of our core protagonists. And I should point out that this film was not written by Oda. Film Z was written by Osamu Suzuki, but I guess Oda didn't seem to have an issue with it. However, he is at the very least aware enough to keep that stuff out of the manga, but it does come out in the anime every now and then, and it's also what contributes to Sanji getting a bit of a raw deal in the anime. I think that manga Sanji would have grounds to sue anime Sanji for defamation. That's when he's even on screen at all, that is, because something that probably goes unnoticed by a lot of people, I guess intentionally, is how often Sanji just gets cut out of a shot that he was meant to be in. For example, there's an amazing panel right at the end of chapter 1089 where it is revealed that the crew have captured York and everyone's looking very cool, doing their own thing. Sanji's even in the background there, celebrating by serving food and making heart eyes, very notably in the exact opposite direction of Bonnie. And now let's look at the anime adaptation of this, and this, it's just funny. Because in the anime, Sanji's not even there at all. Look at the void between Monkey D. Luffy and Rob Lucci that Sanji's meant to be filling. The dude just got cut out of the group photo. Sanji is the only character that the anime deliberately cut out of this scene. And look, I get why this decision was probably made. It's because in the manga, it looks like Sanji's the only character in motion, whilst the others are mostly static. And so it would be the more cost-effective thing to do to cut out Sanji instead of animating him just for a background pass. I say cost-effective, not time-effective, because they took a 6-month break before this episode aired. So unlike almost every other episode, there was definitely time to put Sanji in at least. And there's also another thing that Sanji fans do get quite annoyed at. But bear with me because this one takes a bit of explaining. In chapter 1073, S-Shark shoots a laser beam at Edison, which explodes, and then we instantly cut to Sanji having saved Edison and leaving Zoro a bit confused at just how quickly Sanji managed to appear by his side. It's a pretty straightforward event, but the anime makes this weird. S-Shark shoots at Edison, things then explode, and then we have a filler scene where Frankie saves Lilith, which is cool, definitely not complaining about more Frankie action, but it takes a comically long time for them to land, and then even longer for Lilith to look back. We just sort of freeze on her face for a bit, and suddenly she goes, "Oh, Edison!" It takes so long for her to look back at the explosion and call out to Edison, and only after lingering on the debris for what feels like an eternity does Sanji finally leap out of the smoke carrying Edison. It's a terribly adapted scene for lots of reasons, but this essentially accomplishes 2 things for Sanji. The first is that it completely diminishes the speed that was portrayed in the manga. The idea of the scene was that Sanji was able to save Edison before he got hit by the laser, and Sanji appears on the ground in an instant. But the way it's portrayed portrayed in the anime is as if Sanji saved Edison after he got hit by the laser, in which case he's not very saved, because it takes almost 20 seconds from seeing Edison get hit to Sanji leaping into action. And look, I know that 20 seconds doesn't sound like a lot. Like everything else in this video, it's probably going to be labeled pedantic, etc. But 20 seconds is an awfully long time when you're getting shot at by a laser beam. And consider this, 20 seconds would be 2/3 of the time inflicted by Foxy's slow beam. So it took Sanji almost an entire slow beam to react to Edison being shot at all. And the reason why this happened is, again, because of filler. They can't have the scene play out with the tight timing that this sort of action scene needs. So there's this awkward 20 seconds where Toei just honestly don't know what to do, but they need the time there. We've got this 20 seconds where a character gets shot at, the character explodes, and then everyone stands there and assumedly looks at the remains of his robotic corpse falling to the ground, until it's revealed that Sanji somehow stepped in and saved Edison 20 seconds after he exploded. And then sometimes the anime just goes out of its way to play up Sanji's potential for weirdness, like taking this close-up from the manga and turning it into a close-up where it looks like Sanji is taking infinite backshots. Honestly, I don't mind that sort of artistic liberty. I really love the Sanji face. And the anime is an adaptation, so you know what? Make those expressions more extreme and defined, why not? But I would say it's applied in a very unbalanced way. With Sanji, these facial liberties get taken a lot more than every other Straw Hat. With every other character, the anime mostly sticks to exactly how Oda draws them. And so with Egghead Island especially, this sort of thing is a death by 1,000 cut situation for Sanji. Everything I've mentioned in this video is small, so very small, and these small things, they keep going wrong for Sanji. And so they eventually add up into a big thing, whether it's being beaten up and defeated by an opponent that gave him no trouble in the manga, whether it's simping over a child, being cut out of scenes entirely, or just generally having your presence rather diminished. And all of this has led to the meme that Vin Smoke Judge is the CEO of Toei, and doing all of this on purpose to take revenge on his son. Me personally, I don't believe this is malicious, and it does definitely happen to some extent with other crew members as well. It's not just Sanji. But the reason why we notice this so much with Sanji is because he actually has a decently active role in the story, whereas most Straw Hats kinda don't. A lot of them just get relegated to the background. And what that means is that Toei are forced to use Sanji a lot more to extend episodes, most of which is unnoticed and honestly goes quite well. But every now and then there's a filler scene of Sanji that's quite poorly thought out or implemented or both, and it's the culmination of these odd scenes that do make anime Sanji look like a bit of a joke compared to his manga counterpart. This doesn't happen with Zoro because there's a universal understanding that he needs to be cool. That's what he is. But Sanji has always been a more comedic character than Zoro, and so I think that gives the anime staff license to toss him around and make more fun of him than Zoro. And to be fair, that's exactly what Eiichiro Oda does in the manga as well. But the key difference is that Oda doesn't compromise the cool moments that Sanji does get, nor does he take the goofy ones too far, at least not since the nosebleed days of Fishman Island. I don't think that Toei hates Sanji. In fact, sometimes I think they may like him a little bit too much, which is where stuff like acting like a dog for Stussy comes from. My bet would be that a lot of people at Toei very much identify with Sanji and don't mind living vicariously through him from time to time, and so that barrier gets pushed a lot more than Oda does. And as much as I used to think that the Sanji diminishment was the irate ramblings of the internet, I do now very much understand where those people are coming from, as Toei does often undercut Sanji. That's probably not how they see it, a lot of it's probably accidental, but it is what it is. More changes have been made to the One Piece anime that were not in the manga, in some cases changing the perception and canon of various scenes, events, and characters, such as Mr. Bartholomew Bearman himself. In episode 1132, the anime shows us a very wrathful Bartholomew Kuma. In the manga, all we see is that Kuma arrives to the battlefield in South Blue, then a close-up of a very, very serious and angry man, and then we cut to the Revolutionary Army having won the battle, which, the way I've just explained it, makes it sound slightly underwhelming. But the key takeaway that Oda wants on these 2 pages is this expression on Kuma's face, because it tells us everything he's about to do without actually showing it. However, the anime chooses to then show us a lot of violence, with Kuma beating the crap out of knights and even using an Ursa shock, and we also cut to a close-up of blood dripping off his hand afterwards to emphasize the brutality of this rampage. It's a very interesting exercise in the seen versus the unseen. Personally, I think that the way that it happened in the manga was slightly stronger because I really liked seeing that look on Kuma's face and having me question just how far he's going to go and not knowing. My imagination had to insert the ensuing events. However, I think there's a very good argument to be made for the way the anime handled it as well, because watching Kuma beat the crap out of people is quite cathartic, a very necessary release of anger after Jinnie's capture, and if anything, I wish they'd made this fight scene a bit more brutal if we are going to go all out in that direction. Like, have Kuma completely lose control for a moment and then regain his composure. But again, after everything that's happened to Kuma, watching him fight is like releasing a pressure valve for the viewer as well. And one much appreciated thing that the anime added was a cameo from a young Bunny Joe. He's a fairly prolific background member of the Revolutionary Army, who you may best remember as the man who freed Nico Robin on Tequila Wolf. And because the anime staff seem to really like him, they also add Bunny Joe to a shot in episode 1133, crammed into the bottom left part of the screen. Mr. Bunny Joe, not in the manga, not in this part of the manga anyway, but because the Revolutionary Army is such an unexplored entity, I always like when the anime takes opportunities like this. It's not much, but it is nice to see that little bit more historical cohesion within the group. However, by far the biggest creative change to this episode was the anime's decision to show us Jinnie's face after being afflicted with sapphire scales. So I've gone on and on about this in other videos, so I'll keep it as brief as I can here. But in the manga, Eiichiro Oda made the choice not to show the reader any part of Jinnie's face. The most we saw was a completely blacked out silhouette, and this was out of respect for the character. Jinnie did not want Kuma to see her like this. She wanted to be remembered the way that Kuma last saw her. And what Eiichiro Oda did was he gave the readers that experience as well. We never see Jinnie at her worst, ravaged by the disease, and the last time we see her in her entirety is the previous chapter in the prime of her life. Happy and smiling. That is our memory of Jinnie. So on principle, I don't know if I'm a huge fan that the anime showed Jinnie's face. Not only that, but they showed it over and over and over again. However, it did give us two pretty amazing moments. The first was a bit of filler with baby Bonnie on the ship to the Sorbet Kingdom. Bonnie reaches out to touch one of Jinnie's sapphires, and this is adorably heartbreaking, knowing that these beautiful jewels that baby Bonnie is so entranced by are going to go on to completely destroy her life. But it's also the only moment of mother-daughter bonding that we see in either the anime or the manga. The manga especially has nothing like this. So it is definitely nice to see that connection between Bonnie and Jinnie. And the second thing of interest is that due to being able to see her face, the anime chooses to have Jinnie die with a smile. So she's given a Will of D death, which is nice because it justifiably solidifies her in the pantheon of tragic flashback figures who have died with smiles like Kozuki Oden, Dr. Hirolook, Belmare, and so on. And in a weird way that only kind of exists in One Piece, dying in this manner also gives the viewers permission to move on pretty quickly, which we do need to do because our focus immediately switches to Bonnie. And so having the knowledge that Jinnie died with a smile on her face and that her will now lives on is a different but not at all bad move from the anime. And also this scene ends in a very lovely way with the sun moving up and covering baby Bonnie, giving us that very blatant symbol of light re-entering Kuma's world, and also a bit of foreshadowing, or in this case forelighting, of Bonnie's Nika-ish future. But what I think this episode does best is that it gives us a lot more time of Bonnie's childhood. There is a ton more time with baby Bonnie. In particular, we see her crawling and taking her first steps, and then the montage of her growing up is significantly extended from what it was in the manga. Because in the manga, Bonnie's good years add up to about a single page. Eiichiro Oda has this tendency to kind of blitz through mundane history. He just likes to hit a few key points and then it is straight back to the heart-wrenching drama. And I get why. For the pacing of the manga, it's pretty essential that you keep chapters moving and that you don't spend too much time exploring the same idea. For the anime, however, they have the luxury of being able to linger in spaces like this, which can hold attention and emotion through the addition of music and cute voice acting. And long story less long, I really appreciated seeing more of the blissful, mundane years of Bonnie and Kuma. Especially for Kuma because he doesn't get a lot of high points in One Piece. So when they do arrive, I don't don't want them to end. I want him to hold on to them for just a little bit longer. However, the anime also made a very expected edit where in the manga, Bonnie sticks her middle finger up at the kids who are calling her a vampire. And in the anime, this is changed to a fist, which I personally find much more disconcerting, as it now looks like Bonnie is threatening to fist them. But the One Piece anime has a long history of censoring Oda's surprisingly frequent use of the middle finger, I guess not wanting to encourage children to emulate said behavior. And there's also a small, but I think quite relevant edit to the part where Kuma does the Nika dance for Bonnie. In the manga, Kuma also sings the drums of liberation as he does the dance. You know, the doom da da da. But the anime leaves this out, and the scene has the classic One Piece bar party music playing over it, which, classic as it is, I've been listening to it for more than 2 decades now, I think it's pretty lazy. And One Piece desperately needs some new music that wasn't made in the 90s. And maybe this has something to do with the Japanese professional animator who came out and said, I think Toei should fire the One Piece sound team immediately. It's unprofessional work. However, there is lots and lots of professional work happening in episode 1133. In the beginning, there is an added scene of a child with her father screaming for her mother, who is assumedly dying in the fire started by King Bakori in order to conjure his own great terminal incident. And this is a really fun example of what I call compound filler, because this was constructed as a deliberate parallel to the anime-only scene where Kuma's mother is taken away from him and his father. And it's later revealed in a flashback that Kuma actually went back to the fire and ended up saving this child's mother, thus saving this little girl from having to walk down the same path of tragedy that Kuma himself did. So to me, this is filler done right, as it directly adds to the overwhelming rage that Kuma feels when he's attacking King Bakori's palace. In the manga, Kuma's motives are understandable because Bakori, well, he's being a bit of a dick. But the anime takes that extra step to make this a personal connection for Kuma. The idea that this wasn't just an attack on the people of the Sorbet Kingdom, it was a threat to put every child in the kingdom through the hell that Kuma himself has been through. And so I think it makes a lot more sense as to why Kuma fully cracked here than it does in the manga, because this is his personal trauma being reactivated. And the way that Kuma is attacking Bakori is almost like he's attacking the world nobles who killed his family. So I think that's a big win for the anime here. And with King Bakori himself, there's a couple of extra notes, literally extras, as there are 4 new background characters created for this episode, being King Bakori's creepy smiling guard dudes, all of which remind me a bit of Nanika from Hunter x Hunter. And it's almost as if they're wearing masks, like a Commedia dell'arte mask denoting an archetypal kind of character. So Bakori is just surrounded by these hollow caricatures, and it does a very good job of removing all humanity from these people, carrying out the slaughter of civilians with these twisted false joy boy smiles. And when Kuma does attack, Bakori fires at him, which didn't happen in the manga. And apparently, according to the anime, Buccaneer bodies are completely bulletproof. In fact, even Kuma's clothes are bulletproof because Bakori's bullets bounce right off the fabric, which isn't very consistent with how Buccaneer bodies function in the world of One Piece, especially because Kuma's father was killed by a single bullet, and Kuma himself was pierced by a fairly generic arrow on God Valley. So mate, as cool as it is to make Kuma look like a man of steel here, I don't think this is a very well thought out piece of filler. Unlike the scene where Bakori returns with the Marines. As is pretty standard for Oda with Kuma, and as we're used to through these videos now, a lot of the action here takes place off screen in the manga. We just see the ships, we then see a close-up of Bakori, then Kuma, and we immediately cut to the aftermath of the ships having been destroyed. And something I do quite appreciate here is that the anime decided to invest in a short but extremely well animated sequence of Kuma jumping into the air, conjuring a shockwave and delivering it. Typically, I'm not a huge fan of anime-only action, because throughout most of the history of One Piece, it tends to be extremely lackluster. 1, because they don't have the manga to use as a storyboard guide, and 2, because filler historically needs to be added as cheaply as possible. And action scenes don't really go well with low budget, so it mostly just ends up looking a bit garbage. Not in this case though, because the anime has really stepped up its game with original action sequences of late, dedicating time, money, and talent to what has been, for most of its run, by far its weakest area. And they also added a couple of reaction shots to this sequence, with the standout one being this Marine looking up at Kuma in the air. And look, there's no confirmation of this, but I am convinced that this is a reference to that meme of Willem Dafoe looking up, because this image it's just so specifically detailed that I think that someone at Toei Animation was just having a bit of fun. And as we move on, we have a young Bello Betty appearing in episode 1133. And something that I forgot to bring up in the previous video is a very confusing question that we had as fans reading the manga at the time. When chapter 1097 came out, we had that group shot of the Revolutionary Army, and in the bottom right, you can see a woman who was suspected to be Bella Betty, the eventual commander of the East Army. And the anime confirms that this is indeed Bella Betty. However, there's actually an Oda inconsistency here because this doesn't match up very well with the timeline. Because Bella Betty in our current time is 34 years old. And this event took place 22 years ago. So Bella Betty in this manga panel and subsequently this anime screenshot would be 12 years old. So in this appearance, she's supposedly the same age as Jewelry Bonnie is in the modern day. And I know that this is anime we're talking about, but there is nothing you can say to convince me that this fully grown woman is a 12-year-old. At least not again. We've already done that once with Bonnie. And what it took to make it work was one of the most overpowered magical fruits in all of fictional existence. And look, sometimes I don't know if this is just me in my headspace, maybe it is, but you let me know if you saw this as well, because there's part of the scene where Kuma brings Bonnie to see Vegapunk, where Vegapunk is marveling at Kuma's body and not only staring right into his crotch, but also pretty blatantly grabbing it. And because Vegapunk always has his tongue out, it looks like the beginning of some very cursed yet creative Rule 34. Although a couple of rules are broken in episode 1134. Quite a bit of filler in this one, mostly these small dialogue extensions. For example, Saint Saturn's dialogue is extended by having him speak to Vegapunk before issuing the conditions to Kuma, and they have this brief back and forth about the impact of using Kuma's body for the Pacifist Project, with Saturn sharing his concern about the perception of using a world-renowned criminal as the face of their peace program. And this is a very cool little addition actually, because it very much highlights the differences between Saturn and Vegapunk in the realm of science, with Vegapunk being portrayed as the more pure scientist, completely unconcerned with the symbology and politics of Kuma. All he cares about is that the science lines up and there will never be a better candidate to bring this science to life. Meanwhile, Saint Saturn cares a lot less about the science itself and more about how that science can be used as propaganda for the world government. So it's a small but good addition, I think. Sometimes anime original dialogue can feel a bit empty and hollow because you can just feel that it's written for the sake of adding time to the episode rather than for the sake of adding substance to a character. And thankfully, this is a case of the latter because it gives us more insight into the dichotomy of Vegapunk and Saint Saturn. But during the scene, there is also a shortcut to a filler section of Bonnie running through the lab. And this one I'm much less a fan of because it gets inserted in between Saint Saturn stating his conditions and Kuma agreeing to the conditions. In the manga, we pretty much cut straight to Kuma agreeing with tears of joy because even though he's been asked to do something so horrific, it is such an easy decision for him if it allows Bonnie to live. And I personally like how quickly Kuma is able to make this decision. And the anime artificially extends this by cutting to Bonnie running through the lab, as I just said. And other than to fill for time, my guess as to why this was added would be to remind audiences of Bonnie and have her cuteness fresh in our heads when Kuma agrees to give his mind, body, and free will to save her. But it feels a bit superfluous to me, and more that it takes something away from the original scene rather than adding a layer on top. However, an amazing example of adding to a scene comes right after this. In the anime, there's an awkward moment where Kizaru comes out of the negotiation room and Sentomaru sees him and yells, "Ojiki!" But Kizaru just says nothing and walks away. This is not in the manga, but I really like it because the anime are making a pretty solid attempt to humanize Kizaru a lot more than the manga did. And here it is showing just how affected he is by witnessing Kuma's decision. And it also builds on the Kizaru-Sentomaru relationship, which is definitely not as well explored in the manga as I would have liked. And something else I loved about this episode is that later on, the anime adds a section of Kizaru pressuring Sentomaru to get up and do the Nika dance with everyone, which is such a great little moment, as is the close-up of a genuinely happy Kizaru, the happiest he's ever been and probably ever will be in his life. So the anime is definitely giving Kizaru a lot more nuance. It's allowing viewers to like him a lot more. In the manga, he was much more of a stonewall. You can almost never tell what he's actually thinking or feeling until right at the end of the arc. And knowing that it exists, I really do like seeing the softer side of him. Something else the anime's done quite well has been adding to the Sentomaru and Bonnie relationship in general. In the manga, what we see of them is more or less a couple of background drawings of Bonnie annoying him, but this episode does quite a bit to fill those gaps and show us that begrudging love that Sentomaru has for this supremely annoying yet adorable child. And that in turn adds a lot to the extremes that Sentomaru goes to in order to save Bonnie in the modern day. And quite possibly the most most intriguing change of this episode to me comes with the reaction of the Whitebeard pirates to the news of Bartholomew Kuma being announced as a warlord of the sea. And this is because Jinbei goes all the way here and actually name drops Hanafuda, who was the former warlord of the sea defeated by Ace, and who also happens to be the father of Ulti in page 1. Very few people know any of this, even manga readers, because it's not actually in the manga. We only know that this guy exists thanks to the SBS question and answer segments, and so when this scene happened in the manga, Hanafuda was definitely not named because he had yet to be revealed at the time. And I was hoping that the anime might actually take this as an opportunity for some filler and maybe animate a short section of Ace and Hanafuda fighting. Unfortunately not, but weirdly enough, this is the first time that Hanafuda has been mentioned in a version of the main story, so that's definitely a fun addition to the anime, although one that's probably going to do nothing but confuse the anime-only watchers. Jump Festa 2025 has happened, and as always, Mr. Eiichiro Oda has provided his annual address to the readers and watchers of One Piece with information about what to expect next year in regards to the anime, the films, the live action, and most importantly of all, some tantalizing spoilers about what's going to happen in the manga. These messages are always a lot of fun to cover. It's a nice little annual ritual for us. And as usual, the translation of this message was done by Arta from the Library of Ohara, who is one of the most invaluable resources that the English-speaking fanbase have. But Jump Festa this year is a bit of a unique occasion because Frankie's voice actor Kazuki Yao has retired, and so Eiichiro Oda started his annual message with a bit of a tribute. Super! Yao-san, I'll never forget the time you took me to that queer bar and the memories we made. Thank you for being Frankie for so long. No matter where you go, we'll always be Nakama. And Subaru-san, I look forward to working with you from now on. I'm pleased to meet you. So this year served as both a farewell and an introduction. Kazuki Yao, in a shockingly sad maneuver, brought a Frankie Speedo on stage and dramatically laid it down onto the floor, symbolically saying goodbye to Frankie. And after he faded back into the darkness, Frankie's new voice actor, Subaru Kimura, came on stage and picked up the Speedos. And this is such a classic One Piece thing where out of context it looks completely absurd, but in context it was actually extremely touching. And I do think this is a glimpse of what's to come in the future. It may not be next year, the year after that, even 5 years, but eventually all of the Straw Hat voice actors are probably going to have moments where they symbolically pass on the role to the next generation. So let's say Luffy's voice actor passes on the Straw Hat, Zoro's voice actor passes on Kuina's Wado Ichimonji, etc. Because now that one retirement has happened, this could break the seal and let everyone else know that it's actually okay to retire, because the full original crew is never going to be together again from this moment onwards. But in regards to our new Frankie, Subaru Kimura, at the moment he's probably best known as the voice of Todo in Jujutsu Kaisen, but something that completely blew my mind is that he's also Tendo in Haikyuu, which shows incredible range. I never would have put those together. However, this does tell us that he's the right guy for the job, because both of these characters are, how do I put this nicely? I'm not going to. They're complete weirdos, lovable weirdos, who have to be taken seriously due to their respective strengths. So I do think that they found the best possible option given the circumstances. But let's get into the rest of the message. To everyone who came to Jump Festa, hello, it's me, the fit, primitive, and glamorous Eiichiro Oda. So this year marks the 25th anniversary of the anime, so we kicked it off with a whirlwind of events. The opening of the Harajuku Mugiwara store, and releasing the One Piece base app, to the point where 2024 ended before I even realized. So to cover this, if you've never been to Japan, then Mugiwara stores are the reason why I need debit cards to have daily spending limits. They're exactly what they sound like, a mixture of both permanent and pop-up retail stores that sell exclusively One Piece merchandise, and they frequently have limited edition items exclusive to the store, sometimes exclusive to the individual store, so you've got to visit more than one. I don't know how true this is, but it's said that these Mugiwara stores carry approximately 10,000 unique One Piece items. I didn't even know there were 10,000 unique One Piece items. But this makes them very dangerous for people like me. However, they're extremely popular, so much more popular than I would have thought for an individual store dedicated to one series. But with the new Harajuku store, there's now 15 Mugiwara stores, mostly in Japan, but there's also one in Taipei, one in Bangkok, and even one in Shanghai. Actually, I'm looking it up now, and forget what I said about Bangkok. Apparently, the Thailand store closed in 2019, so shame on you, Thailand. But the rest are still good to go. And as for One Piece base, I believe believe this is an app that's going to be released worldwide in 2025, but at the moment it's a Japanese app, and its main selling point is that it gives you the ability to read all of One Piece, as well as the Vivia Card data books, a bunch of other stuff, and it even has a function where you can turn yourself into a One Piece character and make your own bounty poster with Oda's art style. I'm honestly not sure how this app would function with a worldwide release, because it feels like having all of One Piece on this app would be directly competing with Viz, and as for all the extra stuff like the Vivia cards, they don't even have official English translations. So I'll be honest, I've got no idea what this app hopes to offer us, and it might just be another one of those weird One Piece products. There's a lot of those. But you know what? What I would really love right now is an official app to play the One Piece card game on, because it's looking like the One Piece TCG is actually starting to get quite good. A lot of the complaints I had about the initial set release seem to have been addressed, and the cards themselves look and feel fantastic now. They've really invested into the art instead of all the lazy crap they were doing with the anime screenshots. But what I really need to just push me over the edge is a decent way to play it online. And I know there's a fan-made app, but honestly, it just doesn't look very good. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad that someone made it, but it really shouldn't be up to the players to create the infrastructure to play the game it is you're trying to sell. But let's continue with Oda. I'm deeply grateful to all the amazing staff that contributed to One Piece. Fan letter was amazing too. Right, so I'm very, very glad that Oda mentioned fan letter. One Piece fan letter was a project that was made to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the anime, and I think it may be the best One Piece anime project I've ever seen, and possibly even one of the best anime projects, just full stop. I didn't end up making a video about it, and I do kind of regret that because it 100% deserves your attention if you're watching this video. But the premise is that it focuses on a bunch of ordinary citizens and marines that live on Sabaody Archipelago, and it explores a lot about how the everyday person lives in the crazy world of One Piece. For example, there's this really great segment that takes place during the Battle of Marineford, where we follow two stock standard marines doing everything they can to just not die in the presence of all of these godlike figures. And it's such a cool perspective of the One Piece world that we never see. Because from the very beginning, Luffy has been well above average. He wasn't even properly challenged until Crocodile, so he was OP right from the get-go. And so I really enjoyed seeing how regular people live in the One Piece world. The main focal point is a young girl who idolizes Nami, and who has been following the Straw Hats and rather cleverly figured out the 3D2Y message, and so it's now her mission to deliver Nami a fan letter. I really don't want to say too much more about it, you should watch it. I do believe it's something that every One Piece fan should experience, and if it helps sell it a bit more, it was directed by Megumi Ishitani, who was responsible for some of the greatest One Piece anime episodes of all time, including 1015. It's also only 20 minutes long, which I think is my only complaint with it, which is more of a compliment. When it ended, I just wanted more of it. I would take an entire anime series just following the fan letter characters, and whoever else I wanted to throw in there, because it is a really cool concept for a more laid-back, expanded universe sort of One Piece series, more of a weekly slice of life anime that takes place on Sabaody, and because Sabaody is such a nexus point of the One Piece world, that gives you a brilliant excuse to have just about any other character show up for a cameo here and there. Although the ultimate takeaway from One Piece fan letter is just to let Megumi Ishitani do whatever the crap she wants. I have yet to see something she's touched that hasn't turned to gold. And if I was Toei, then what I'd be doing right is I would open my vault, I would take out all of the money, deliver it to her doorstep, and get her to direct the next One Piece film, which Oda does address later in this message, but first. And particularly, I enjoyed my visit to South Africa, where the live action is being shot. As I wrote in my message on the experience, I was humbled by the love the whole staff and cast have for One Piece. A lot of people told me, One Piece is already popular worldwide, so why even bother putting so much effort into a live action? Yes, it may be popular in the animation industry worldwide, but if someone told you new unexplored horizons await out there, wouldn't that make you want to go after them too? And that is, I think, the best way I've ever heard the live action described. It's very difficult to disagree with that because it's full on Luffy mentality. There's an adventure out there to be had, and so it shall be. And while I'm not the biggest live action fan myself, I have definitely been seeing its positive effects. Over the past year and a bit, there has been a fresh influx of One Piece fans who were inducted by the live action, and from there devoured either the anime, the manga, or both. So as far as I can see, it is acting as a pretty decent gateway. But I don't think that's the end of Eiichiro Oda's ambition. He has commented before on his desire for One Piece to eventually win an Emmy, which depending on how technical we want to be is very possible, because live action One Piece was nominated for 11 Emmy categories. However, it was for the Children's and Family Emmy Awards. So it's not, the Emmy, and it probably never will because it's being tied to kids TV. But I would be shocked and disappointed if One Piece didn't win at least half of its categories, because it's not going up against particularly strong competition. And this is probably the best way to think about One Piece live action going going forward, to not go into it expecting prestige television, but to look at it as more of a family show. However, you can tell how much of Oda's focus is taken up by this project and where his passion lies, because just talking about it takes up a quarter of his Jump Festa message and there's nothing at all to say about it, which is kind of surprising actually. I would have thought that this would have been the place to announce the season 2 release date, because we're currently anticipating it to be next year, or at least that's what Garp's actor said, that the show should be ready before Christmas 2025. But enough about what Garp's actor said, here's more of what Oda is saying. So whether it's the manga, anime, film, or live action, I will give my best. Basically, we will be preparing for various new announcements next year for One Piece as well. Please look forward to the return of the anime as well. And I actually am eagerly anticipating the return of the anime, which will be April 6th in a brand new time slot. It will now be airing at 11:15 Japanese Standard Time on Sundays, which is a wild time slot. But it's very interesting because 15 minutes after the anime episode airs is when the new chapter gets released digitally worldwide. So now those Sundays are a bit of a double shot of One Piece. And it's such a huge shift from its previous Sunday morning time slot, which hopefully should come with less censorship issues. But I think that what most of us are hoping for is that this is going to fix the pacing issues of the anime. And I'm personally hoping for a scenario where we get new One Piece for 6 months a year, and the other 6 months is spent with a remastered project. Like how the remastered Fishman Island is currently being aired, which did have a bit of a shaky start, but I think has been quite good actually. But giving the One Piece anime a 6-month gap every year should allow all of the Egghead, Elbaf, and whatever happens from there on out to be done with decent pacing. But Oda did also comment on the future of One Piece films. I mean, sort of. He didn't confirm anything. A lot of people are posting on Twitter as if he did confirm something. But what I will say is that we are definitely due for an announcement. The trend with the One Piece movies is that there's a new release every 3 to 4 years, and the last one was Film Red in 2022. So we'd be looking at a 2025 announcement for a potential 2026 release. And I have no idea what this movie could possibly be. It's going to be a rough ask to top Film Red in terms of box office performance and the general scale of the project, so good luck to them. But finally, we now have the main meat of the message, which is Oda addressing the future of the manga. As for the manga, at last we have reached Elbaf. Everything seems to be laid back and all in this country, but the arrival of a certain man will break that calm. Meanwhile, we'll also see abnormal phenomena happening in the other oceans. That man will finally begin to stir up the world. Enjoy the breather while you can, for you may not get a chance to catch your breath again. So this is a particularly crazy message because Oda has used the term that man on 2 occasions, almost certainly referring to different men, and instead of that man, I'm going to go so far as to call them those men. And I do think we know who the first that man is, because Oda was referring to someone who would arrive on Elbaf and cause all sorts of problems, and it would seem very likely that this is our Shanks lookalike who appeared at the end of chapter 1134. And if so, that's quite interesting because it's now positioning him as more of the arc antagonist, which I'm all on board for. And it would be pretty funny if the second that man Oda mentioned was Shanks himself. And so those men are both Shankses making big moves. But there are a lot of other possibilities. Oda says that that man will begin to stir up the world, and it's always tempting to think of that man being Shanks because he's a simmering pot we've been waiting to see stirred ever since chapter 1, and I want to know what kind of 3-decade slow-cooked meal is going to come out of it. But mates, this is a big kitchen and there are so many other pots. As this could also be referring to Blackbeard, who is actively doing things. The last time we caught up with him was Lafitte infiltrating Umid Shipping Company, so Blackbeard is about to do something real big. And you know what, to give him all the credit in the world, Blackbeard is always doing something. During the Egghead Island arc, the Blackbeard pirates infiltrated Egghead, defeated Trafalgar Law, and took down Garp during the sword raid on Hachinosu. And you compare that to characters like Shanks and Dragon, and it's just like, what were you two even doing? Which, speaking of, Dragon should be kept in mind as a possible that man candidate, because the Revolutionary Army properly kicking into gear is definitely an act capable of stirring up the world, because it's not just about them as a faction, it would be about the Revolutionary Army inspiring entire countries worth of people to rise up against the world government. So maybe 2025 is the year that Dragon finally makes his move. I wouldn't bet money on it though. I've been burned a few too many times by expecting Dragon to do anything. But we should also talk about Emu. After feeling Joy Boy's throbbing haki thanks to Emmett, Emu may take a more active role in global events and become the world stirrer, especially because of the previous statement Oda made, which was that we'll also see abnormal phenomena happening in the other oceans. That's just it's such odd language, but it may refer to a continual rise in global sea levels, or anything else that Emu might be capable of, which is apparently lots. What I do really like about that part of the message though, is that it hints hints at Elbaf being structured similarly to Egghead Island, which involved large segments of not spending any time on Egghead Island itself and instead following events in the wider world. And I really hope that's the direction that Elbaf goes in as well, because I think that Oda has struck gold with this format on Egghead. It made the arc feel so much bigger, and it gave us a nice break, a nice getaway from being in the one location for 2 years. And because we're really getting into the final saga now, I don't know how much more story Oda can afford to tell off screen, because we're now starting to play out the events that the entire series has been building up to. So I want to see what Blackbeard's doing, I want to see what Crossguild are up to, I want to see Dragon, Shanks, etc., all of them. And it does sound like a very exciting year. But this does come with a caveat that everything that Eiichiro Oda has said might not be happening this year and might be something for the future instead. Oda has a habit of overestimating how far his plans are going to get in any given year, and often his mild spoilers don't come true until the following year, which is especially important to keep in mind lately. In 2024, only 32 chapters of One Piece were published, which is on par with 2023 for being the lowest chapter count years in One Piece history. And from here on out, I'm not sure if it's going to get any better than that. This message has definitely made that clear to me. In addition to his health issues and the fact that Oda should be taking more actual rest breaks, Oda's ambition for One Piece outside of the manga is also going to slow things down. But I'm extremely excited for 2025 nonetheless. I think it's going to be another massive year, and my personal prediction is that 2025 is going to be the biggest year of Shanks to date. Why is One Piece so impossibly difficult to start? Let's get straight into unzipping the crotch of this video and talk about length. This is by far the most common reason people have for not starting One Piece, and that's more than fair because look, it's a big commitment. The manga began in the previous century in 1997, the anime in 1999, and if you want to read or watch either, then you're looking at over 1,000 chapters or over 1,000 episodes. Starting One Piece can feel a lot like proposing on a first date. You don't know this person, but you are signing up to spend a massive chunk of your life with them. Although the funny thing is that people have been saying this ever since I first started reading, which given my truly advanced age was a long time ago. When I was a young lad trying to recommend One Piece to people, it was the exact same response. Mate, look, I don't know if I could read a series that's almost 400 chapters long. There's a lot. Which is a number that seems incredibly manageable and laughable now, given that we've almost tripled it. So I can imagine that the issue has only gotten worse now that there are over 1,100 chapters, and even if you have 24 hours of free time each and every day, this is likely going to be the single most time-consuming endeavor of your calendar year. Again, it's a big commitment, especially in modern times where television has been working tirelessly to reduce commitment issues. For example, the Netflix model of 8 to 10 episode series, committing to 8 to 10 hours is a much easier decision to make than seeing the One Piece anime and knowing that what you're signing up for is over 400 hours. I mean, what even is 400 hours? It's such a large number that it becomes difficult to mentally quantify. And I think this is a huge part of why Wit Studio are currently producing the One Piece anime remake, which would be designed to partially fix the issue by offering seasonal content. It's much easier to recommend someone to try out one season of 26 episodes than to recommend a series of 1,000+ episodes, which is such a mess to keep track of. Because as a weekly series, the One Piece anime doesn't even divide into seasons, at least not cleanly, which makes it seem that much more unfathomably big. How many seasons of One Piece are there, you ask? 1. How many episodes in that season? Over 1,000. I will say that the English dub does try to divide its production into seasons, but that also becomes a big mess because you end up with releases like Season 14, Voyage 15, and it all just blends into this mush of meaningless numbers. Like how Attack on Titan started calling everything the final season, Part 3, Part 1. That's what all of One Piece sounds like with the English dub, but let's get back to length. My counter to length is that it's only an issue if it's something you're not enjoying. And if you could be promised the greatest media experience of your life and have that extended into what seems like an eternity, then doesn't that sound like a pretty damn good value proposition? And crazily enough, a common complaint you'll hear from One Piece fans who are caught up is that it's not long enough. Everyone who's caught up is desperately craving more fictional pirate content on a weekly basis. And that's why I often describe One Piece like a drug. The story, the characters, and the world are so good that people get genuinely addicted to it. But not in a way that ruins your life. In a way that gives you a shining beacon of happiness every week to look forward forward to, and in a way that makes us all envious of everyone who hasn't started One Piece yet, because they have an infinite story banquet ready and waiting to consume. Length is one of the greatest strengths of One Piece. It's long because it is a true epic of our generation that deserves and demands that time, and I promise you it will be worth your time. However, the other most common roadblock to commencing fictional pirate enjoyment is simply the art style, which is an acquired taste for many, often evoking a very goofy, childish impression, and for good reason. You'd be surprised just how often many of these goofy elements evolve into rather shockingly relevant plot points. But it does initially give the impression of One Piece being a kid's show or kid's manga, and to be completely fair to this impression, the target audience of One Piece are Japanese teenagers. However, it's one of those series that has managed to transcend that target audience, and in fact, according to surveys in Japan, the target audience only makes up 22% of total consumers of the series, with 70% of One Piece fans being aged between 20 and 70 years old. And on the upper end of that scale, 35% of fans were between the ages of 40 to 70. So it definitely has a broad appeal. And if the art gives you the impression that this is just a kid's show, that is definitely not the case. It's hard to describe because I don't think we have a Western equivalent of it, but One Piece seamlessly integrates very serious adult content with very youthful gags. We've had multiple genocides, slavery, racism, human experimentation, cannibalism, and so much more, including several allusions to the outright word that starts with R, and I can't say it on this channel because it'll get flagged. Which isn't to say that One Piece is a super dark and edgy series, it's not, but it does have those elements, which just happen to be juxtaposed against the most ridiculous moments of comedy, which creates an incredible contrast because the moments of drama and horror hit that much harder being surrounded by so much levity. Just when you think you're in a wacky, fun world, nothing can go wrong, everything's amazing, something goes wrong, and it goes wrong bad. It's a series of high emotional highs and very low emotional lows. There are moments where you'll never feel happier, and there are moments where you'll never feel sadder. And in between those, moments where you'll never feel like someone deserves to be punched in the face harder. It delivers on all fronts. And the only reason why it's able to seamlessly blend between all of those emotional beats is because of the art style. You just wouldn't be able to pull this off in a more sleek and serious world. And being off-put by the art style isn't an issue exclusive to One Piece. The exact same opposition to art style happens with any series that deviates from the manga norm, and another great example would be JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which I think is initially an even more difficult hurdle to overcome, but in both cases it is well worth getting over. But also, One Piece is sometimes hard to recommend to people because of the premise of the series, which is Yara and pirates. Lots of pirates. And honestly, pirates in our current media landscape, they're kinda lame. And I think this comment sums it up quite nicely. What stopped me was actually the premise. I hated pirate stories as a kid with a passion. I initially planned to hate watch it, being One Piece, before it accidentally became my favorite show. And I think that is a surprisingly common experience. Not to actively hate watch One Piece, but more succumbing to it. To be worn down by your sheer awareness of it, and then you actually give it a go, and then whoops, you've just accidentally a whole life-changing experience. As far as I can remember, there's only been one time in my life that pirates have been particularly cool, and that was during the prime Pirates of the Caribbean era, which is well over. But other than that, pirates have been a bit of a pop culture outcast for the past few decades. So to a lot of people, One Piece doesn't have that conceptual hook. It sounds kinda lame, especially as an anime or a manga series, because very rarely does one turn to an anime or manga experience for something that is such a well-worn concept in the West. A lot of the appeal of anime and manga comes from that immersion into Japanese culture, which I should say is still very present in One Piece. However, when you compare the proposition of pirates to, say, a series about ninjas or shinigami, the latter two tend to evoke a much more cool and much more intriguing feeling. A sense of mystery that the Western world hasn't already done to death. Because everyone has preconceived notions of pirates, and those notions are almost certainly the yarn me hearty bring the grog type. But One Piece pirates are not those traditional pirates. There are giant pirates, zombie pirates, cyborg pirates, fish pirates, beast pirates, sky pirates, and even female pirates. In fact, every pirate you can think of, except for stereotypical pirates, exist in One Piece. Genuinely, think of a thing right now and then put the word pirate on the end. It probably exists in this world. And part of this is because the author Eiichiro Oda is trying to tell the story of how that stereotypical pirate came to be. So we're on a journey to get there, which means no peg legs, no parrots, and there's even an explicit rule that there are no eye patches. At least not until the end. There will be one. So if the idea of pirates was putting you off, then let me just say very quickly that you're gonna forget about everything you thought you knew about pirates. But we do have another hurdle to jump, which is, sure, conceptually, I'll give it a go, but where do I even start the One Piece? Compared to, say, Western comics and series, you might think that One Piece is a fairly easy starting point. You just say, alright mate, I don't know why I did did in English. But you say, all right, made in whatever accent you want, and then say chapter 1. That's your start point. But I've always found this a bit awkward because I don't think chapter 1 is a solid launching point. And this is an issue that is exclusive to English speakers because in the early days, the Viz manga was not a good translation. It was put together very sloppily and with a children's audience in mind. So a lot of the dialogue is really cringy, trying to appeal to small children, and it's translated very haphazardly. Now the manga does get a lot better, but it's definitely a rough start. And on top of that, for anyone not familiar with the concept of reading manga, which is most anime watchers actually, it's a big adjustment to get used to reading panels right to left. I tried to read it when I was 8 to try and impress a girl in my class who was a fan. I didn't know manga was read right to left back then though, so I dropped it after chapter 1 because it made my head hurt. And a lot of you are probably going to say, it's skill issue and move on, but it's still a consideration. It's one more mental hurdle that makes people not want to bother running the race. Open up the manga, you go, what the hell is this? How do I even read you? I've got better things to do. So putting that to one side, in that case, how about starting with episode 1 of the anime? Seems fairly simple, but this comes with caveats as well, because the Toei anime is now 25 years old. And while it definitely kicks off with a charming 90s nostalgic style, the anime has aged, and it's becoming increasingly more difficult for it to command attention over modern series, like say Demon Slayer or Attack on Titan. Again, this is why Wit Studio are producing a remake, because as much as I have nostalgia for the anime, the fact that it looks so ancient, I mean, it's in 4:3 aspect ratio. Nothing's been in 4:3 for like 20 years. That is a challenge to get people to give it a shot when they have so many other modern choices. Not to mention that the anime is packed with filler, some non-negotiable filler in the early days that gets integrated with canon stuff and it just gets a bit murky. But then I suppose now we also have the new entry point of the One Piece live action, which is short, only 8 episodes. Very easily digestible, but that's also what hinders it. They had to cut out so much to fit a whole saga into 8 episodes that it is very rarely what I would recommend as a launching point. I'd only do it if you were dealing with someone who was adamant about not watching anime or reading manga. In which case, yeah, why not give it a shot? Give that person a little taste of the flavor of the world and make them go, maybe anime or manga, not so bad. But also, in defense of the live action, it does seem to have converted a pretty disgusting amount of people who were not One Piece or even anime fans in general prior to its release. So it's doing something right and well worth considering. But on this issue, even though I am a manga supremacist, I would personally recommend someone starting with the subbed anime. I think it's the easiest to access because it's both free on Crunchyroll and it's also on Netflix if you already have a subscription there. And reading the manga is not free. It requires a Viz subscription. You need to go out of your way to pay cash money to do so. Unless you want to find some certain methods on the internet, which they do exist. But the anime doesn't have the initial translation problems, and I think it's currently the best opening to the series that English speakers have available to them. Now, here is a new problem. When I was in high school, One Piece had practically no fan base, and I'm talking both online and in real life, especially in real life. So it was a huge struggle to recommend a series that no one else was reading or watching, because naturally you'd think, there's probably a reason for that. And in general, it was so much easier to pick up Naruto, buy an Akatsuki cloak, and immediately become part of a much larger established fan base of ninja appreciators. But these days, One Piece has the reverse problem. There are so many people so thoroughly invested in it, all making videos on the internet telling you to watch One Piece, that the sheer hype behind the series is actively turning people off. There's actually a term for this. It's called hyperversion, which is the innate tendency to avoid works that people have specifically told you that you will love. And One Piece fans are very guilty of generating some of the greatest quantities of hyperversion. Because we constantly say stuff like greatest story of all time, good world build, no, great world build, no, phenomenal world building, the characters, the fights, the fruit, it will change your life. The way we sound to outsiders is almost like a religious cult. And every time we preach the word of One Piece in those lofty sentences, no matter how true it may be, and it's very true, what it does is erects an insulating wall around everyone not currently invested in the series. So weirdly enough, if you really want to get someone into One Piece, you need to be a bit more casual, you need to be a bit more suave. Tone down the language to a more subtle, mate, this is pretty good, and let that seed of curiosity germinate within the minds of your victims. Because One Piece has so many hurdles to get over as is. We don't need another one. But if you are on the fence and just maybe consider this your gentle push, go and watch an episode or 2 or 3 and make up your own mind instead of listening to strange men on the internet. Although, if you do insist on listening to strange men on the internet, then subscribe to the channel because you cannot have it both ways. Either you subscribe or you watch One Piece. That is the deal. Did you know that Enel has actually appeared in Wano? I'm 100% serious, by the way. This video is not clickbait. This happened, and I'm going to show you how and when. But here's a clue. It was not recently. However, Enel has been featured in Wano, just definitely not in the way that you'd expect. Hello and welcome to the Grand Line Review, your source for everything One Piece. My name is Liam, and this is quite possibly one of the most interesting videos I've ever made. Because today I present to you a tale with more twists than Charlotte Smoothie making juice out of a woman who stabbed 100 men. Yes, that's good juice. You know, it really is the 100th stabbing that really adds the fullness to the flavor. But this is the story of what happens when you take an arrogant lightningman, an overreactive fanbase, and a twist of reality so bizarre and unpredictable that Eiichiro Oda himself would be compared to stare in stunned disbelief. Quite similarly to how Jade Hardy, Denzel Taylor, and Hehe are staring at disbelief as their status as subscribers of the day, which they obtained by committing the shockingly powerful act of subscribing to the Grand Line Review, thus resulting in consistent injections of One Piece culture being administered directly into their YouTube feeds. And if you'd like to be our next subscriber of the day, then hit the button and please do say hi in the comments below if you are a new member of the Grand Fleet. Welcome. Now, something else. Here we have a rather scantily clad Enel. That's because throughout this video, we are going to be dressing him in Wano appropriate attire, based solely on suggestions from you, the Grand Fleet, with our first one being a katana stuck in his exposed chest. Okay, wow, that's a slightly violent way to begin, but let's do it. To be fair, a samurai is essentially naked without their blade, so before we consider any clothing whatsoever, yes, a katana is definitely in order. And there we have 1 times katana. Alright, so to lay some groundwork here, Enel appearing on Wano is not exactly a new idea. In fact, Enel appearing anywhere is also highly unoriginal, as throughout the decades of the One Piece, the fanbase has consistently theorized that Enel will appear anywhere and everywhere, such as Fishman Island, Dressrosa, and even in your pantry. Perhaps hiding in a jar of moon pickles, which apparently exist, and I don't like that. But it's all part of the great 5-step cycle of fan theories. Step 1. Inception. An idea takes root deep within the mind brains of One Piece fans. Let's use the Enel on Dressrosa example. This ever so questionable thought began when a fan pointed out that this toy from chapter 741 looked mildly like Enel, purely based on the fact that they both have similar ear floops. I mean, earlobes would be the more correct thing to say, but I prefer floops. But after this comes step 2, justification. Having spotted the potential for a bit of that sweet online clout, fans then dig deeper for meaning. For example, this toy is thinking, Straw Hat Crew, what are they doing here? Which makes sense because Enel, he hasn't seen them since Skypiea, hence the surprise. Furthermore, earlier on in the arc, Luffy had also made Enel's trademark shock face when he saw Sabo, which is certainly Oda clearly foreshadowing Enel's presence on Dressrosa. But most importantly, how did he get to Dressrosa? Well, that was explained also, although I use the word explained very liberally. But according to a very outside of the box idea, Enel rode back down to Earth on one of Fujitora's meteors before finding himself face to face with Sugar and becoming toyified. Step 3, headcanon. Now that we have a working theory of how the ridiculous idea functions, we now commit it to headcanon and continue to read One Piece blissfully assuming its correctness. That is until we hit step 4, which is disappointment. The stage where it is revealed that the ridiculous fan theory was nonsense all along, and in this particular case the toys turned back into various people and one gorilla. But whelp, wouldn't you know it, Enel is not there. This is also usually the step where people start calling Oda a bad writer for not implementing their headcanon, before swiftly moving on to step 5, conveniently forgetting about how wrong they were with this idea before moving on to the next piece of raving lunacy. And I know, step 5, it has a long name, but we've got to be scientifically accurate here. That is the cycle of One Piece fan theories. However, we've got a bit of a shock happening on this particular occasion. Pun, honestly not intended, but you're going to think it's intended anyway, so you know what? Intended. But when it comes to Enel in Wano, the crazy fans were technically correct. Also, when it comes to fans, our next Enel dress-up prompt is Enel should get a samurai mustache. And admittedly, I wasn't entirely sure what this was, so I looked up samurai mustache and found what I'm going to call a very bold image worthy of a thunder god. So I went with that. Alright, great. Now he has a sword and facial hair. Maybe we'll actually start dressing him soon, but I make no promises. But what was the inception of this amazing Enel on Wano idea, while step 1 comes to us courtesy of the ending of chapter 1004. Here, Oda presented us, as he often does, with a very tantalizing silhouette. In this case, it was a mystery character present during the raid on Onigashima, with most people's thoughts immediately heading to the standard answer of Hiyori or even the tinfoil explanation of Toki. But within some very special mind brains, another thought formed altogether. You'll notice that this silhouette has a very distinct, I suppose what I'd call some form of floop, dangling suspiciously in line where human ears would generally appear on heads, and it certainly did not take long before an artistically inclined fan drew Oda's full silhouette, revealing this mysterious presence to be the one and only God Enel. Now, in case you're under the illusion that this is some kind of joke, well, you're only mostly correct. Whilst the vast majority of fans dismiss this as a case of the lulz, there was a powerful segment of online denizens who moved straight on to step 2, justification, with our first primary argument being the classic, why not? Which is eloquently summarized via Reddit with the following post. Why can't it be Enel? Maybe you can't think about a good reason for him being here. Oda might have a whole badass story prepared which will blow our minds. I strongly believe it's neither Toki nor Hiyori. Hiyori would be a pretty boring reveal for an end panel, and Toki wouldn't contribute anything to the story nor to the fight, unless she uses her powers to port Kaido 5 billion years in the future or something like that. Which is actually a surprisingly relevant point. Why can't Toki just zap Kaido a century or two into the future and save Wano? You know, completely deny Kaido's existence in the current timeline and make him the problem of a future generation, which is also known as the climate change solution. And speaking of climate change, this is going to be our first justification for this here picture thing being Enel. Because earlier on in chapter 1004, Oda dropped a juicy line in the mouth hole of one Nami who stated, "I need stronger lightning." Mighty convenient that Nami flagged the need for strong lightning in the exact same chapter that ends with a potential lightning god showing up. A very clever piece of foreshadowing from Oda there. From here, the desperation to get Enel on Wano led to forming a connection between he and Fukurokuju, a man who also has rather notably elongated ear floops. Furthermore, if you look at Fukurokuju when he was younger, his head was less like an aubergine and more akin to that of an egg, which is also how Enel's head happens to be shaped, as well as almost literally everyone else's. But that doesn't matter because the idea became that Enel was Fukurokuju's son, and that 10 to 20 years from now, Enel's head would also grow and become super long. But that is not enough. And we also need a thematic justification for why Enel is on Wano. And we also need to keep dressing him, so here's our next prompt. I think he needs a badass Kaido leather jacket, complete with horns. And you know, I can't help but feel that Kaido was going through a bit of a rebellious phase with this whole leather jacket thing, but I suppose Enel could be infiltrating the island as one of the beast pirates, so then yeah, let's go with it. I mean, he really doesn't look too out of place at all for the very questionably dressed crew of Kaido. But thematic justification for Enel's presence was quite hastily made, much like a group of drunken mates drawing over the face of their temporarily unconscious comrade. It was brought to our attention that Wano and Skypiea are directly tied together through Wano being known as the country of gold and Shandora being known as the city of gold. Part of Enel's design was also incorporated into the Oniwa Banshu member Raijin, and in fact there was even a thought that Raijin was Enel himself. Here guys, I want to share info with you. I believe one of the ninjas, the one that is on the catfish, is Enel. Just look at his back. How many characters can have it? And after research, the god riding catfish is Thunder God. I really think we have something here. Cheers, PS, can someone put photo of him in comment section, thanks. So there you go. Further adding to the Enel on Wano lore. I imagine he joined the Oniwa Banshu to serve under his father, Fukurokuju, and instead of lightning, he adopted fire for reasons. Oh, and also he really likes catfish now. But furthermore, Enel having gone to the moon was perfect because the Kozuki clan, and in fact Wano in general, is directly tied to the moon through the house crest and even the kanji for moon in family names, specifically Kozuki and Amatsuki. But so what? Moon symbology is everywhere, and gold, well, it's a common substance. I mean, it isn't. By definition, it's quite rare, but it's like commonly rare because it pops up in a lot of places, just like Enel apparently. But the wildest justification for him being on Wano came in the form of one of the most intriguing deep dives in into the pit of speculation that I've ever witnessed, which is the following. The best clue that would make sense for Enel to show up I have come across is the connection between the Japanese gods of nature Raijin and Fujin. Raijin's appearance is an obvious influence on Enel's design, and Hyogoro made a point earlier in the arc that Luffy's Gear 4th bore a resemblance to a god of Wano, which closely resembles a Fujin. It could make sense if Luffy's form shows some sort of connection within him to Wano, and that the same could be said of Enel. These Japanese gods' mythos are connected to storms, and the powers Kaido has displayed in his dragon form seem very familiar. There could even be some connection so far unknown to Luffy's father's suspected weather storm powers, and Wano's obvious connection to the hidden history of the One Piece world. But that may be an even bigger stretch to connect dots. Or this could all be wrong, and I'll look really dumb when the chapter comes out. And as it turns out, it was the second. Or was it? Because as much as I've made a mockery out of this idea so far, these people had no idea just how right they were. Also, Enel here still needs clothes, so let's do that. A propeller hat. Ah yes, the iconic traditional Japanese propeller hat. It would be awfully suspicious for Enel to be wandering around Wano without one of these, so thank God, who I guess is Enel himself, that we had this suggestion. This is probably some of the worst work I've ever done. Now look, I'm no artist, but this is bad even by my standards. But very conveniently for a man wearing a propeller hat, this whole Enel on Wano business took flight, and is arguably still soaring with the various pieces of fan art, fan animation, and memes spawning from its very existence. Most of which were very self-aware and not at all taking this idea seriously. I particularly enjoy this one featuring Enel as Cheems, or I suppose Cheems as Enel. But to demonstrate how much of an impact this idea had, this theory even spawned its own parody theories. A great example is the Virgo on Wano parody, whereby a user hypothesized that the mystery silhouette from chapter 1004 was in fact Virgo because the ear flute perfectly resembled Virgo's face with a spoon hanging off the side. Quite the jocular response. However, on this occasion, it was we who were destined to be the Jokers. And you know, if I had some sort of clown makeup, this is exactly where I'd be putting it on because that is exactly what I am. I denied any connection between Enel and Wano. I chuckled arrogantly at the thoughts of all the theorists, which sounded something like this. Ho, 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 ho. But after a long, rambling video thing, guess what? I was wrong, but so were the theorists, because they had it backwards. Enel didn't come to Wano during Wano. Enel had been there in the past. And as it turns out, Enel does have a connection to Wano, just not where and when and how, or even who you'd think. And the crazy thing is, this connection dates all the way back to 2004, which for some context was just after Skypiea. I believe we were in Water 7 at the time. But this ultimate piece of information comes to us courtesy of the real-life organization Enel, an Italian multinational energy company whose name stood for, and excuse my awful and, let's be real, non-existent Italian, but it stood for the Ente Nazionale per l'Energia Elettrica. And in 2004, Enel performed an action that would flummox One Piece fans over 18 years in the future, when it joined the World Association of Nuclear Operators, also known for short as WANO. And that utterly blew my poor, simple mind brain. Enel is in Wano. And to celebrate, we need to finish dressing him with our final prompt being, I want to see him wearing high heels. Yeah, sure, but I've really got to start vetting these suggestions. But we got to give the fleet what they want. In this case, the fleet want to remove the L in that word and just become feet. So sure, here's some fancy high heels. Is there a way to hold this? There is no right way to hold it. It sucks. And I think what we've rather accidentally done here is create Dellinger. The horns, the hat, the heels, we've just basically put Dellinger in a leather jacket. That's what we've accomplished here. I should also say that at the time of this recording, the silhouette from chapter 1004 still has yet to be properly revealed. So you know what? Sure, I am ready and willing for Enel to emerge any week now and prove me wrong in regards to his current whereabouts. So we're gonna chuck a very skeptical bookmark into this one and temporarily close the tome of madness that is Enel on Wano.